The topic of this tangent is 1, why does everyone hate freedom? And 2, why does everyone love being vigorously spanked like a bad little girl?
You've been a bad little girl and you're getting a vigorous spanking right now.
One could go so far as to say it's like daddy's home and he's taking his belt off.
You know, it's like daddy arrived and he's taking his belt off.
Let's start by stating the obvious. People conceptualize political leaders as parents. We talk about this every video, comrades. American children learn in school that George Washington is the father of our nation. Napoleon said, "You are right to call me your father. I live only for the honor and happiness of France." Stalin, well, just look at him. "We love you, Papa Stalin. Can I have a pony, Papa Stalin? Where's my real dad? Mein Vati." Okay, politicians are daddies, you get it. So what? Well, in this tangent, I will argue that thinking about politicians as parents means that the way we think about authority within the family is intertwined with our political behavior and beliefs. And we could trace this back to the beginning of time, but in the interest of efficiency, let's start in relatively recently in the year 1620, when this fucker called Robert Filmer wrote a book called Patriarcha, not subtle, arguing that the divine right of kings derived from patriarchal authority inherited from biblical patriarchs and originally Adam, the father of mankind. The father is the daddy of the household, the king is the daddy of the kingdom, and God is the daddy of daddies, the king of kings. Anyway, all of that got disrupted by liberals, like John Locke and Thomas Paine, who had this woke idea that all men are created equal, so there is no natural hierarchy, and the father only has authority over the children so long as the children are not old enough to manage their own property. So for the goddamn libs, authority is not natural, it's derived from the consent of the governed, the social contract, basically this big metaphor where all of society is like a giant business relationship between property holders. And of course, history shows exactly where this kind of thinking leads, to stuff like women voting and transsexuals drinking beer. It makes me sick. It makes me want to throw up. And politics today is still largely an argument about what we think the metaphorical role of the father is, with the general consensus being that conservatives are daddy and liberals are mommy. So in the US, conservatives submit to Trump's authority enthusiastically because they see Trump as daddy and they see masculine authority as legitimate. It's a natural order, the hierarchy with the father at the top. God the father, Trump the daddy. Whereas conservatives, and honestly a large percentage of leftists as well, see feminine authority as a usurpation, an illegitimate violation of the natural hierarchy. Why? Well, because everyone hates women and nobody respects them. You see this in the way people talk about wokeness. The woke scold does not command. She scolds. She nags. Wokeness is a nagging bitch wife mother. A nagging bitch wife mother who must not be listened to under any circumstances if the white race is to be preserved. It's why the conservative pundit says, "Listen up, white men. I'm not talking about yuppie liberals, I'm talking about real salt-of-the-earth white men. I'm talking about the kind of white guys you see at Home Depot."
I'm not talking about yuppie liberals. I'm talking about real salt-of-the-earth white men. I'm talking about the kind of white guys you see at Home Depot.
We all listen to common sense. You know who's holding us back? Women? Jews.
We all listen to common sense. You know who's holding us back? Women? Jews. It's women that are saying, "Oh, but you can't talk like that." It's your girlfriend, it's a woman in your life, a friend, it's your mother, it's your sister, it's your aunt, it's the women in our lives, maybe a daughter.
It's a nagging bitch mother, sister, aunt, daughter who always says, "Oh, you can't say that." When you see, a brother coming up behind you with no license plate, and you say, "I need to get away from this person," she's not even paying attention.
When you see a brother coming up behind you with no license plate and you say, "I need to get away from this person," she's not even paying attention.
So white men need to tell women, shut the fuck up. And it's also the Jews. It's always going to be the Jews.
So white men need to tell women, shut the fuck up. Very important. And it's also the Jews. It's always going to be the Jews.
You're probably thinking this video is going to be about Freud and psychoanalysis. No. You'll be expecting that. Let's start instead with some hard science. I know everyone thinks of me as a soft humanities person, and I am, but if I need to get hard, if you want me to get hard, I can. I can get so hard for you. And I will. Part 1, getting so hard for you. Cognitive linguistics. Why don't we start there? Is that hard enough for you? I can get harder. And I might, but I'm going to surprise you with it. The cognitive linguist George Lakoff wrote a book with Mike Johnson called Metaphors We Live By. The book is about metaphors, obviously. Metaphors We Live By is about the metaphors that unconsciously structure human thought. Now, people might think we're already doing psychoanalysis because we're talking about the unconscious, and people are skeptical of that idea because they associate it with psychoanalysis. But there's different ways of thinking about the unconscious, and some of them are just self-evidently real. Like, for example, what percentage of your memories are you currently conscious of at this moment? Probably like 0.0001%, right? But all those memories that you aren't conscious of are still influencing how you act and think in some way, right? The Freudian unconscious is more specifically an unconscious of repressed drives, whereas the unconscious that George Lakoff is talking about is more of a linguistic unconscious, a symbolic unconscious that's kind of built into the public language that we all use. So the idea is that metaphor is not just a poetic device. My love is as a fever longing still. And yes, I realize that's a simile. Congratulations, you passed high school literature. What do you want, a fucking medal? In everyday speech, we talk about being lovesick, implying that love is in some sense a disease. Something that afflicts us. Or we talk about being heartbroken, implying that we've been shattered, that we've been made not whole in some way. So whereas Western philosophy tends to traditionally think of poetic, metaphorical language being sort of irrelevant to a discussion of analytic, precise language, according to Lakoff, that's actually kind of a nonsense distinction. There sort of is no such thing as literal language. So for example, conservative Christians will talk about their belief in a literal interpretation of the Bible, but that's a nonsense claim. What would it mean to say the Bible is literally true? Behold the Lamb of God. Okay, so you're saying that Jesus of Nazareth is literally a young sheep. I am the bread of life. Okay, so Jesus is literally a loaf of bread? That doesn't make any fucking sense, Gorge. The Bible is obviously a heavily metaphorical text, but Lakoff's idea is that everyday language is full of these dead metaphors, that is, figures of speech we don't even really perceive as metaphorical because they're so basic to the language. So for example, the metaphor that time is money is so ingrained that we don't even usually think of it as metaphorical when we talk about spending time or wasting time. The metaphor life is a journey structures a lot of the way we think about a human lifespan. And we use the journey metaphor for every important aspect of our life. Career, relationships. You could say that I'm in a dead-end career, right? Or a dead-end relationship. Or your career or your relationship can be going in circles, or it can take a new direction. A lot of our most basic metaphors are derived from the experience of being an embodied animal. They relate to processes of the body, like the idea that creating something is giving birth. Or they relate to sense experience, like I talked about in the conspiracy video, this very universal metaphor that knowledge is light, ignorance is darkness, or awareness is being awake, being woke, being red-pilled, whereas illusion is being asleep or dreaming. When we say, I see what you mean, or he's blind to the facts, we're using visual perception as a metaphor for knowledge. We often talk about morality in terms of spatial positioning, where goodness is up and evil is down. A fall from grace. Heaven is higher than hell. Morality is also often spatialized as a path, with the straight and narrow being the moral and the deviant being the immoral. The term straight, meaning heterosexual, derives from that metaphor. It's like Isaiah chapter 40. Every valley shall be exalted, and the crooked shall be made straight. What does that mean? It's describing the arrival of the Lord. Does it mean that the terrain will literally be flattened? No, you fools, it's a goddamn metaphor for a spiritual path. The crooked is the immoral, the wayward, the deviant. To be made straight is to be made spiritually correct. And that idea is expressed musically in Handel's Messiah. Are you all familiar with Handel's Messiah? You really should be, because it's one of those rare moments in musical history where the entire album is all bangers. But I had a music history professor once who taught the tenor aria, Every Valley Shall Be Exalted, to show us what's called text painting, where Handel uses music to illustrate the thought. So the line, the crooked straight, is sung with the crooked being melodically crooked and the straight being just a single held note. The crooked straight. So we have multiple metaphors in play, right? We have the spatial metaphor of crookedness and straightness, the moral metaphor of morality as straightness and immorality as crookedness, and then the musical metaphor where the pitch represents space. Higher pitch is up, lower pitch is down. That's not inherent to sound. That's a human metaphor that we use to describe pitch. But in that aria, the pitch metaphorically evokes the spatial orientation, which itself metaphorically invokes ideas about spirituality or morality. Not to brag, but I'm actually a published co-author on a neuroscience paper that's basically about this. Bam! Hard science. You weren't expecting it. I got you. I guess I didn't really do most of the sciencey stuff. I just designed the stimuli that were going to be shown to our, undergraduate guinea pigs in the MRI. And the idea was to see how the brain processes these cross-modal associations between visual space, sonic space, and metaphorical semantic space. Anyway, that's as hard as I'm going to get. It's all going to be softer from here. We're going to get soft. Speaking of metaphors we live by, STEM people really love this hard, soft metaphor, don't they? They're so proud of the hard sciences. They're so fucking hard, as if being a harder science allows them to penetrate deeper. A lot of the Dworkinite radical feminist critique of sexuality is based on drawing out the consequences of exactly that kind of metaphorical conceptualization of intercourse as dominance, of penetrating as an act of subjugation and possession. It shows up in language all the time, especially combined with abstract concepts being personified. Like when we're talking about the economy, we'll say, inflation is screwing me. Inflation is screwing me. There's a lot of metaphors going on there. One, the idea of inflation as some kind of agent, and then screwing as in fucking, a metaphor for domination. I'm being fucked. I'm being dominated by inflation. This is a bad deal. We're getting fucked. Metaphors. To again go back to Bible interpretation, the concept of God is so abstract that it can only be approached metaphorically. Lakoff gives this list of metaphors for God attributed to his colleague Eve Sweetser. These are from the Yom Kippur liturgy. God is a father, humans are his children. God is a king, humans are his subjects. God is a male lover, humans, or the Jewish people, are his female lover, beloved. God is a shepherd, humans are his flock. God is a vineyard keeper, humans are his vineyard. God is a watchman, humans are the treasure. God is a potter, humans are the clay. God is a glass blower, humans are his glass. God is a smith, humans are his metal. God is a helmsman, humans are the rudder. I think it's interesting that Abrahamic religion almost always avoids feminine metaphors for God. So I mentioned how motherhood, giving birth, is often the metaphor for creation, and there's not a shortage of world religions, especially polytheistic ones, where that is how the divine origin of humanity is conceived, from a mother goddess. In Abrahamic religions, that maternal element of God has been sort of strategically omitted, with a few exceptions, like the 15th century mystic Julian of Norwich, who in her visions conceives of Christ as the feminine part of the Trinity, and even refers to Jesus as mother. The argument of metaphors we live by is that the metaphors we use are not just a stylistic matter, but that these actually structure the way we think and act. So to use one of Lakoff's examples that I have also dwelled on a lot in the past, a common metaphor for argument is war, right? Someone will say, I attacked his argument. I destroyed it with facts and logic. If you think of argument as a war, that determines what you think of as the goal of an argument. And that, of course, will have effects on the way you argue. If you instead thought of argument as dancing or as flirtation, then you might argue differently. The goals and values of an argument are determined by the underlying metaphor. Even worse than the war metaphor, a lot of men online, in my experience, will conceptualize argument as rape. But thinking back a decade ago, it made a very deep impression on me, like how often some guy I was arguing with online would conceptualize his argument as sexual violence, right? You just got your asshole blasted open by my throbbing, turgid argument. It's one of the most exhausting things about masculine culture, this tragic, desperate need to constantly assert dominance. What is it these men want? You want me to call you daddy? Is that what you need? Is that what you need to get off? I'm crazy like a fool. Part 2, Daddy versus Mommy. In his 1996 book, Moral Politics, George Lakoff argues that the divide between American liberals and American conservatives can best be explained by underlying metaphorical systems related to the morality of the family. So for Lakoff, the metaphor that underlies politics is the nation is a family, the leader of the nation, the president, is the father. And according to Lakoff, the reason why debates between liberals and conservatives are so unproductive is that we're just talking past each other constantly, because the real root of the disagreements are different moral systems based on different conceptions of how a parent should act towards their children. He calls the two moral schemas strict father morality, which is what conservatives adhere to, versus nurturant parent morality, which is for libs. I really think it should be called nurturant mother morality, because I think that this conception of a parent is obviously derived from a mother. I feel like if you dig deep enough, human metaphors are always traced back to something basically mammalian, and breastfeeding is the model of nurturance. But I think Lakoff says nurturant parent morality because most of the time the politicians we're talking about are men, even if they are in the nurturant parent position. I'll talk about that more later, but let's first start with strict father morality. Strict father morality views the ideal family structure as being hierarchical and led by a dominant, punishing father. It's a model of morality based on the ethics of punishment and reward. Lakoff calls it folk behaviorism because there's almost a kind of classical conditioning element of conceiving of how to raise children, right? You need to punish their bad behavior and you need to reward good behavior. And that is sort of imagined as the father's primary role, is administering those punishments. This view assumes that humans are by nature inclined toward evil, which is a real force in the world and a force inside all of us. And the way to be a good parent, a good father, is you have to beat the evil out of your kids. So according to strict father morality, corporal punishment of children is not only acceptable, it may actually be required, right? It may actually be immoral not to beat your kids, because discipline teaches self-discipline. And the goal of strict father morality is to produce children and to produce citizens who are self-disciplined and self-reliant and who are able to repeat the punishing, disciplining role of the father, but sort of internally. In other words, the disciplining father becomes the internalized superego, which keeps you from engaging in deviant activities as an adult. Strict father morality sees corporal punishment or disciplining of children in general as an expression of love. So a father beating his young daughter, as long as he's doing it for the right reasons, is actually expressing his love through that violence. As Tucker Carlson explains so eloquently,
You're getting a vigorous spanking because you've been a bad girl. That's not said in the spirit of hate. He loves his children. Disobedient as they may be, he loves them. But he's very disappointed in their behavior, and he's going to have to let them know.
In strict father morality, it's actually considered immoral for a parent not to strictly discipline their child, because that means allowing the child's evil inclinations to go unpunished. And a child who never internalizes self-discipline from the strict punishments of the father will be ruled by evil inclinations and will surely wind up pregnant, homeless, single, and addicted to AIDS. Lakoff describes a network of metaphors that underlie strict father morality, including the metaphor of morality as strength. Moral strength means that you have the willpower to win your struggle against your urges. For religious conservatives, humans are by nature prone to evil urges, evil temptations, and they understand morality as the punishment of those temptations. So in the same way that a religious conservative will usually place a lot of emphasis on heaven and hell, hell tends not to be a very popular concept with liberal religious people, but it's very important to conservatives because they see punishment as ethical. And this is the origin of a lot of religious masochism, right? Because if urges are by nature evil, and if morality consists in punishing evil, then to internalize the punishment dynamic is to have self-discipline. And religious conservatives often place great moral value on the struggle against temptation itself. I recently saw this clip of a religious podcast where it's like these two guys talking about like men's struggle against lust and pornography, and Jesus could take away our temptation at any moment, but he doesn't, because we become moral, spiritual beings in the struggle against our temptation. The temptation is the opportunity by which we prove our goodness, or by which we become good through self-punishment, self-discipline.
We need to understand that Christ could take lust away from a man like that, but the reason he doesn't is because the struggle is our salvation.
From a liberal, hedonistic perspective, this is extremely perverted, of course, because liberals tend not to view punishment as ethical in and of itself. So we don't particularly admire the struggle of someone against lust. We see that as masochism. We don't see a sacred spiritual path in that. Spiritual path, there's another one of the metaphors of strict father morality. Morality as a path. The moral person stays on the path, the straight and narrow path. A deviant strays from the path. And part of the danger of the deviant is that the deviant will lure others to do the same. Right? The deviant, in a way, forges a new path by getting gay married, by becoming a transsexual, by having sex out of wedlock. And if that person goes unpunished, it will legitimize that lifestyle. And that's why they need gay people to be punished. They need trans people to be punished. They need single women who get pregnant to be punished. Because if the deviants go unpunished, then the legitimacy of strict father morality is threatened. Another metaphor is morality as wholeness, integrity, and immorality is disintegration, degeneration. A social conservative will often describe the morality of a society as a fabric, the moral fabric, and the threat of the deviants is that they loosen the moral fabric. They tear apart the moral fabric. So to make society whole again is to make it moral again. And you do that by reining in the wayward sheep, correcting the deviants. And the same dynamic exists in microcosm in the human individual, where someone who is living a life of sin is seen as broken, in need of being made whole again. A related metaphor is, of course, purity, where morality is seen as pure and immorality is seen as filth. For conservatives, the purity metaphor is especially applied to women who are judged, in my opinion, very viciously on the basis of whether they are pure or impure. And then you have the metaphor of health, where morality is health, immorality is sickness. These people are sick. We live in a sick society. Gender confusion is a social contagion. Strict father morality also usually reifies the concept of evil as an active force in the world, which is actually theologically controversial, but I feel like in practice, folk Christianity is kind of polytheistic, where Satan is viewed not just as a lost angel who's far from God, but as a active force in his own right. A consequence of this is that evil is not seen as the product of misunderstandings or being misguided or being traumatized. Evil is not something you identify with. It's not something you try to understand. It's something you destroy. In strict father morality, father knows best. So morality for the children consists of obedience, and morality for the father consists of dictating the law and enforcing it through punishment and reward. And strict father morality places a great importance on replicating itself. So that's going to have an effect on the way that boys and girls are raised, because boys and girls are both punished and both trained to be obedient, but boys are raised with the assumption that the boy will eventually replace the father as the head of his own household, whereas girls are trained for obedience for life, like dogs. A girl must be obedient to her father until she gets married, when she becomes obedient to her husband until she dies, where she gets to go to heaven and sing the praises of God the Father. Hallelujah. Okay, so this is the underlying metaphorical structure. How is this applied to politics? Well, basically what we think of as conservative politics is strict father morality applied to politics. The legitimate ruler is father, and the citizens are the children. So what is valued in a leader is strength, the ability to protect the family like a father should, law and order, the maintenance of discipline, and strict punishment of criminals. Social welfare is frowned upon because that's coddling. It's spoiling the children. Soft on crime, liberal bullshit like opposition to the death penalty is seen as immoral because the leader has a moral obligation to maintain the strict disciplinary regime. So Lakoff's contribution with the idea of strict father morality is the idea that it's composed of all these underlying metaphors. He's far from the first person to notice that having an authoritarian view of the family is the basis of right-wing politics. In 1950, Adorno et al. Wrote a book called The Authoritarian Personality, which proposed something called the F scale, the Fascism scale, which would measure basically how much a participant would agree with various authoritarian statements. This has been updated more recently by a psychologist called Bob Altemeyer, who came up with the right-wing authoritarianism scale, which measures submission to authority, aggression in the name of authority, and conformism to social normality. In 2016, the fascism scholar Matthew McWilliams studied Republican voters' preferences for different candidates in the Republican primary. And he found that the single greatest predictor of whether someone would vote for Trump was authoritarian personality, as measured by people's stated preferences about the moral dynamics of the family. So people who we are labeling authoritarian personalities say that they prefer children who are respectful over independent, obedient over self-reliant, well-behaved over considerate, and well-mannered over curious. I remember reading this finding back in 2016 and being a little bit skeptical of it at the time, because when you say that the biggest predictor of voting for Trump is authoritarian personality, why are we supposed to think that this personality just so happens to exist in some regions so much more than in other regions, right? Well, I think that calling it the authoritarian personality is maybe misleading, because what we're not, I don't think we're talking about like some kind of genetic personality attribute here. I think basically this is a measure of cultural values. Strict father morality is a cultural idea, and it's transmitted culturally, not genetically. McWilliams wrote in 2016, quote, "I found that education, income, gender, age, ideology, and religiosity had no significant bearing on a Republican voter's preferred candidate. Only two of the variables I looked at were statistically significant: authoritarianism followed by fear of terrorism, though the former was far more significant than the latter." So if that's true, and if that's generalizable, then it means that mainstream American politics is fundamentally a culture war. It has radically anti-Marxist implications. It means that material conditions are not really what's causing people to vote for Trump. If Trumpism is more correlated with strict father morality than it is with economic class or income, then what we have on our hands is not an economic problem, it's not a class struggle, it's a culture problem. All right, let's talk about nurturant parent morality. Nurturant parent morality is based on a series of metaphors for morality as compassion and nurturance. The children are hungry, and mother must feed them. It's lib morality. It's an ethics of care that originates from women. Its underlying metaphors are morality as nurturance, originally literal mammalian feeding of the children, but more broadly speaking, the duty of the parent or the government to provide for the children, to make sure everyone is fed, to each according to his needs. Morality is metaphorically understood as happiness or as tending towards happiness. So if being gay makes your child happy, then there's no reason to punish it. Whereas in strict father morality, happiness is not really in and of itself a moral virtue. It doesn't matter if being gay makes you happy if it means disobeying the father and deviating from strict father morality. But in the nurturant mother model, morality is conceived of as happiness and not as obedience. The nurturant parent model conceives of morality as compassion, as empathy. In order to provide for the children's needs, you have to understand what those needs are, and that requires empathy. And the nurturant parent model understands morality as fairness, as equity. You don't show favoritism towards your children. So applied to politics, nurturant parent morality leads to ideas like social programs, social safety nets, socialized medicine. It disapproves of harsh retributive punishment and prefers a justice system based on restoration or rehabilitation. Now, conservatives do value nurturant parenting to some extent. In fact, they often see it as specifically the correct role for the mother. But there's a limitation to that role, and too much of it is seen as spoiling. From the liberal perspective, strict father morality is authoritarian and oppressive. And from the conservative perspective, nurturant parent morality without the strict father element is naive and foolish. At his rallies, Daddy Trump likes to read the lyrics to the song The Snake, which is a parable about the risks of excessive feminine nurturance and compassion.
On her way to work one morning, down the path along the lake, a tender-hearted woman saw a poor, half-frozen snake. His pretty-colored skin had been all frosted with the dew. "Poor thing," she cried, "I'll take you in, and I'll take care of you." The border. "Take me in, O tender woman. Take me in, for heaven's sake. Take me in, O tender woman," sighed the vicious snake. She wrapped him up all cozy in a comforter of silk and laid him by her fireside with some honey and some milk. She hurried home from work that night, and as soon as she arrived, she found that pretty snake she'd taken in had been revived. "Take me in, O tender woman. Take me in, for heaven's sake. Take me in, O tender woman," sighed that vicious snake. She clutched him to her bosom. "You're so beautiful," she cried. "But if I hadn't brought you in by now, oh heavens, you would have died." She stroked his pretty skin again and kissed him and held him tight. But instead of saying thank you, that snake gave her a vicious bite.
So the tender-hearted woman is the fool of this story, and she inappropriately directs her maternal impulses towards this snake that she clutches to her bosom. It's a kind of anti-Christ fable, like a sort of inversion of the Good Samaritan story. The purpose is to validate fear and distrust. Immigrants are compared to the snake, the libs are compared to the woman, and the libs' maternal, nourishing, caring instincts are seen as the height of feminine foolishness. Conservatives respect women only as mothers, insofar as they are mothers, and motherhood is valued in their system as the proper role for women. But maternal nurturance extended beyond the limits of the family is a despised abomination. So women have to know their place, and there has to be a point at which dad comes home.
There has to be a point at which dad comes home.
German women who remained sexually virtuous while producing an adequate quantity of Aryan progeny were rewarded by Hitler with a cross of honor of the German mother. So strict father morality does make a place for women, but that place is in the kitchen. I think to some extent, both strict father and nurturant mother morality are in play simultaneously for a lot of American voters. Which one takes precedence often depends on circumstances. In general, in times of increased fear, of chaos, of war, of terrorism, strict father morality tends to become more attractive as people want discipline and order to be restored, or they want to be protected by a strongman daddy. Lakoff points out that during the Cold War, there was a tendency for Americans to elect conservative presidents and a liberal Congress, as if people wanted an executive daddy and a legislative mommy. There's a general tendency to conceptualize Republicans as the daddy party and Democrats as the mommy party. I think this is basically bad for the Democrats because everyone hates Democrats for many of the same reasons that everyone hates women. So liberals in general, even male liberals, I think are burdened with misogynistic attributions as a result of being coded as mommy. For instance, men and women are often held to very different moral standards. I don't think there's anyone in American politics who's been more demonized than Hillary Clinton, and that perception of Hillary as a demon is tied to her being seen as this ambitious, careerist, pantsuited woman. We generally don't talk about male politicians being ambitious. It's assumed that a male politician would be ambitious, but what is expected in a man is seen as monstrous or demonic in a woman. There's a quotation from Kate Mann that circulates on Tumblr about what she calls the tyranny of vulnerability. Quote, "Misogyny frequently involves morality takedowns or the unforgiving shaming of women for their moral errors. Misogyny also subjects women to what I have come to think of as a kind of tyranny of vulnerability. By pointing to any and every more vulnerable person or creature in her vicinity to whom she might do better, and require her to care for them or else risk being judged callous, even monstrous. Women are mommy, and mommy's job is to take care of me. So if I don't feel taken care of, that's mommy's fault." I think this contributes to the tendency of leftists and even liberals to constantly blame the libs for everything that goes wrong, even when the conservatives are completely in power. We don't blame the conservatives because the conservatives are daddy, and it's not daddy's job to nurture us. It's daddy's job to maintain law and order and dole out punishments. Because we're just little babies and we want mommy's milk. Where is my milk, mommy? Mommy, milky time. Mommy, why won't you feed me, mommy? Part 3. Contradictions. So Lakoff's big claim is that his strict father or nurturant parent morality model explains the actual political positions held by conservatives and liberals, including apparent contradictions that other models don't explain. So for example, conservatives claim to be for small government, and if you take that seriously, it seems like a contradiction, because conservatives have always wanted to expand the military, the police, they're pro-death penalty, all of which does not sound like decreasing the size and power of the government. Lakoff's explanation is that conservatives are not really for small government. What they're really for is daddy government. So in some sense, they want the government to do less. They don't want a nanny state. They don't want a feminine, maternal, caring state. So they see it as not the government's job to nurture, to help people in need, because that is not daddy's job. Daddy's job is to protect, to enforce rules, and to administer vigorous spankings to bad little girls.
You've been a bad little girl and you're getting a vigorous spanking right now.
But there's other kinds of contradictions that come from the idea of strict father morality, which maybe we can explain, maybe we can make it make sense. For example, how can fascists be anti-establishment conspiracists while also being authoritarian submissives who long for a strong daddy government? Well, part of it is that Trumpists, for example, don't actually think of Trump as the government, right? Trump is not the government to them. Trump is the leader, our glorious leader, the God Emperor. The idea of the government they associate with the deep state, which is kind of a nefarious, shadowy cabal. So for the authoritarian submissives, the leader is actually there to protect them from the government. So in a way, maybe it's wrong to say that they think of the government as daddy. They don't think of the government as daddy. They think of their leader as daddy, and they see their leader as against the government, despite the fact that he's officially the head of it. With right-wing conspiracists like Alex Jones, like Gary Allen, there's always this contradiction between, on the one hand, passionate rebellion against the system and centralized control in the powers that be, while at the same time defending religion and the family, which, so far as I can tell, are two of the main authority structures of the system. So how can you be against the system and against centralized hierarchy while also defending religion and the family? And the answer is that they're only anti-establishment in the sense that they oppose forms of authority that they see as illegitimate. So they're actually defending the authority structures that they see as legitimate. That is, they're defending the patriarchal authority structures that they identify with. They're protecting daddy politics. They're protecting strict father values from external threats, such as liberalism, atheism, feminism, cultural Marxism. These are the forces that they're afraid of and that they imagine as a conspiracy threatening legitimate power, the legitimate power of daddy. Like I said in the conspiracy video, when fascists or conspiracists object to the elite or the establishment, they're not expressing anarchist views. They are not against the idea of hierarchy at all, right? What they object to is the perception of a foreign power over us. Their complaint is that the elite are not people like us. So again, the family metaphor is important. They feel that the elite, the establishment, are not family. They're not daddy. They don't want anarchy. They want daddy. Another contradiction is, how do we reconcile American authoritarianism, that is Trumpism, with American individualism? Well, Lakoff thinks the individualist self-reliance is a specifically American version of daddy politics. There's other countries that have strict father morality all over Europe, all over Asia. It's fairly common. But in the US, there's kind of this maybe unique, but certainly distinctive value placed on self-reliance and a resentment of government that Lakoff thinks comes from American culture's extreme separation of adults from their parents. So in the US, your parents have total authority over your life when you're a child and when you're a teenager. But once you're an adult and you move out of the house, and especially once you're no longer financially dependent on your parents have essentially no authority over you. That's the cultural expectation. Americans cut the umbilical cord very decisively, to such an extent that many people from other cultures are actually horrified by, for example, the American practice of putting our parents in nursing homes, right? There's cultures, maybe most cultures, where it's expected that your parents will live with you and that you will take care of your aging parents. We don't do that here. In America, if you have the money, you put your old people out of sight and you pay someone else to deal with them. So this assumption in the United States that the son very decisively replaces the father in terms of authority when he comes of age seems to be related to the American individualist cowboy ethos. It reminds me of this scene in the movie The Gambler where John Goodman explains the concept of fuck off money.
You get up $2.5 million. Any asshole in the world knows what to do. You get a house with a 25-year roof. You put the rest into the system at 3 to 5% to pay your taxes, and that's your base. Get me? That puts you for the rest of your life at a level of fuck you. Somebody wants you to do something? Fuck you. Boss pisses you off? Fuck you.
Fuck off money is the amount of money required so that there is no boss and there is no parent whom you can't tell to fuck off. The amount of money where no one can ever tell you what to do. That, to me, is the American dream. It's not a white picket fence. It's not 2.5 kids. It's having the financial independence that you can tell anyone to fuck off. I believe in this deeply. It's probably the most American thing about me.
A wise man's life is based around fuck you. The United States of America is based on fuck you.
I resent authority. I don't like being told what to do. I fucking hated being a teenager, being in high school. I hated living in a household with parents who could tell me when I had to go to bed. I hated going to school and being told when I could go to the bathroom. But if Americans have a problem with authority, then why Trumpism? Why daddy politics? Well, it could be a number of things. It could be that people who are thinking in terms of strict father morality are identifying with the father figure. So they don't see themselves as being the punished child. They see themselves as identified with the punisher. It could also have to do with the type of daddy that Trump is. Is he really a strict father, moralistically handing down judgments? It's not really his persona, is it? I do think Trumpism is a kind of fascism, but there's certainly a difference between Trump and, for example, Hitler. We think of Hitler as highly controlled. The aesthetics of National Socialism presented at least a facade of being extremely uniform and disciplined. Part of it is that Trumpism is less militaristic than Nazism as a result of historical circumstance. Americans are not trying to regain pride lost in a massive traumatizing world war. Though even so, there has been some recent Anschluss ideation on Trump's part with respect to Canada and Greenland. So I could be speaking too soon here. We're only a few months into this administration. There's time for militarism yet. But in general, I would say that a lot of Trump's appeal to his supporters is that he is seen as an agent of chaos. Slavoj Žižek has frequently commented that Trump's appeal is largely in his obscenity, his permissiveness, his postmodern attitude towards truth, right? His absence of moralism. This man who brags about grabbing women by the pussy and how he could get away with murder is not really in the persona of a strict father teaching discipline and self-reliance. I do think this is a bit of a challenge to Lakoff's strict father idea, which maybe applies less to Trump, in fact, than it did to Republicans 25 years ago. Lakoff claims, for example, that conservatives in the 90s impeached Bill Clinton because strict father morality led them to be horrified by his adultery and his lying, and seeing politics as a family matter, Republican congresspeople positioned themselves as strict fathers who needed to punish this childish president and his apparent inability to control his sexual impulses. That seems a little bit difficult to reconcile with Trump's open obscenity, essentially open adulterousness, multiple divorces, sexual assaults. To me, it's actually very difficult to take conservatives' moral stance very seriously at all in the wake of two Trump administrations. That a vast majority of evangelical Christians in this country have rallied around this blatantly atheistic, libertine, obscene charlatan, I think is revealing about the ultimate emptiness and hypocrisy of their alleged values. But maybe Lakoff could explain it in terms of loyalty as the supreme value of strict father morality, loyalty to strict father values themselves and to the patriarch. I think a lot of evangelicals don't love the things that Trump does. They don't love that he's an obscenity, but they realize that he is useful as a defender of their values, and so they're willing to overlook his personal transgressions, which to me still seems very cynically utilitarian for people who are supposed to be rigidly dogmatic in their religious morality. But okay, whatever. Nothing makes sense anymore. Reason is dead. For progressives, we experience fascism as repressive, so I think it can be hard to understand how for people who are fascists, fascism is experienced as liberating. Trumpism from the beginning in 2015, 2016 has been characterized by followers as a rebellion against insincere liberal politeness, right? This perceived repressive leftism of political correctness, wokeness, feminazis, pronoun police. In other words, that nagging form of liberal maternal authority. The authority that says, that's racist, that's sexist, you can't say that. And for people who particularly resent that type of morality and view its authority as illegitimate, Trump is experienced as a liberator. The fascist finally gets to tell the nagging women, shut the fuck up. And it's the Jews. It's always going to be the Jews.
And it's also the Jews. It's always going to be the Jews.
I do think fascism is a kind of liberation. A perverse liberation, but a liberation. Specifically, a liberation of sadism from the constraints of liberal politeness. I also think Trumpism is asserting the transgressive right of the king. In other words, the rules that the king makes do not apply to him. In his book, Totem and Taboo, Freud tells this kind of psychoanalytic creation myth that's like an origin story of civilization. He imagines a tribe ruled by a primordial father who claims the exclusive right to possess the women of the tribe. And then he tells of a band of brothers that got together to kill the father. And then he speculates that guilt over that primordial patricide is in some way at the origin of human religious feeling. Because on Freud's account, the father is both revered and resented for his power to do what is forbidden to everyone else. The power of the primordial father grants him the ability to do what his own prohibitions forbid. Possess the women of the tribe. And when resentment leads the sons to murder the father, they're left with the lingering feelings of reverence and affection, and so the guilt for the murder. I feel like this sort of primordial transgressive father authority is what Trump is asserting when he says, I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters. To me, this exposes the whole bullshit pretense of strict father morality, which is that the father is granted the power to punish because he's punishing out of love, or because it's in some way good for the child to be punished. It's like Walter White in Breaking Bad, which I want to talk about because I just watched all of it. Walter White is a suburban dad who starts cooking meth, ostensibly because he wants to provide for his family. But as the show progresses, perceptive viewers will notice that providing for his family may not, in fact, be the main motivation. He's in the empire business. He is the danger. He's the one who knocks. The line that separates strict father disciplinarianism from abusive sadism is in fact very blurry. And that's never been more blatant than in Trumpism, where any kind of high-minded conservative moralism has been more or less replaced with blatant sadism. Adorno says of the Nazis, quote, "Just as people do not believe deep down in their hearts that Jews are the devil, they do not fully believe in the leader. They do not really identify with him, but act on this identification, represent their own enthusiasm, and thus participate in the leader's performance." Steve Bannon said Trump got elected in 2016 on lock her up, drain the swamp, and build the wall. Pure anger. Where does this anger come from? Economic anxiety? There's a leftist psychoanalytic theory that it comes from sexual repression. Wilhelm Reich, basically a crazy person who had some interesting ideas, wrote a book called The Mass Psychology of Fascism. Reich divides the modern capitalist character into three parts, which he associates with three different political systems. The surface character level is the level of politeness, of getting along with everyone, being nice to everyone, and he associates that with liberalism. The secondary level is sadomasochism, which he associates with fascism. And according to Reich, sadomasochism is what comes out when you give people permission to stop being polite, but is itself the result of repression. But he takes an extremely optimistic view of human nature, what he calls natural biological sociality, and associates that with socialism, of course. Quote, "In this core, under favorable social conditions, man is an essentially honest, industrious, cooperative, loving, and, if motivated, rationally hating animal. But in an authoritarian, repressive society, quote, drop the mask of cultivation, and it is not natural sociality that prevails at first, but only the perverse, sadistic character layer." So the idea is that fascist sadism is the result of sexual repression. So if we work towards a sexually liberated society, then we will remove the causes of fascist sadism. So if we simply liberate our pulsing life essence, then we can have some kind of organic socialist bio-utopia. I think this is like completely unwarranted Rousseauism, right? Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. I don't agree with that. I take a much darker view of human instincts. So I agree with Freud that repression is necessary for civilization to function. This is, I guess, controversial within feminism. Some people got very upset when in the Twilight video I suggested that the problem with rapists is they're not repressed enough. Some liberal feminists hate the idea that preventing sexual violence requires repression. They take Wilhelm Reich's view, the view of the 60s counterculture, which is that sexuality is basically pure and good, and that if we can just liberate our natural sexual impulses, then that will end all of this sadistic perversion. Now, I don't take this in such an extreme crackpot direction as Sheila Jeffries or Andrea Dworkin, but I guess on some level I am an authoritarian mommy lib. I think some repression of sex and violence is probably necessary. And the debate, I guess, is how to implement that repression. How do we institutionalize the castrating maternal superego? I'm sure that's a question all of us ask ourselves every day. It keeps us up at night. What do you think, Grandma? Ma'am, this is a Wendy's. Where's my bourbon? Part 4, the male loneliness epidemic. So speaking of institutionalizing the castrating maternal superego, I suppose we should address the man-hating allegations. This is why Trump wins, because of libs like you. Trump understands boys. He understands men. He talks about balls. Balls! How Trump, young men, and sports saved America. Oh my God, is the loneliness stored in the balls? So it's true that there is a much discussed widening political gender gap, with young men turning much further to the right than women in countries around the world. Does this have to do with daddy politics? Well, yeah, probably. Men sense, not unjustifiably, that liberal values are more feminine. They're based on nurturance instead of dominance. Now, for many liberal men, this is not a problem, but obviously a large number of men find the feminizing of cultural values to be very threatening. In the introduction to his interview with Andrew Tate, Tucker Carlson laments the feminist misandry that is taking over our schools, asking us to imagine being a 6th grade boy asked to suppress his aggression and talk about his feelings and pee sitting down like a bitch.
Imagine being a 6th grade boy in the United States right now. What are you hearing at school? What are they telling you on the internet? Well, they're telling you to stop being yourself. Sit still. Stop joking. Suppress your aggression. Share your feelings. Obey. Sit down when you pee like a good little girl.
And this is why boys are giving up, Tucker says. They're smoking pot. They're playing video games. They're transing their genders.
You might decide to reject your own manhood and embrace androgyny, or even switch sexes. Girls are better? Fine, I'll become one. Or more likely, you might simply withdraw into porn and weed and video games.
Balls. I don't know why everyone always expects me to be a great voice talking on men's issues. I didn't even want to be a man. Why are men going to want to listen to me in particular? Aren't I like the last person men who feel their masculinity being threatened are going to want to listen to? Well, I don't know. I guess I'm going to talk about it. People often cite atomization and social isolation as being factors in radicalizing people. The implication is often that atomization is inherently bad. I don't know if I agree that it's inherently bad. I personally actually kind of enjoy social atomization, but I'm a genetic freak and I'm not normal.
So Samoa Joe, you take your 33 and a third chance minus my 25% chance, and you got an 8 and a third chance of winning at sacrifice.
You know, I'm like a decadent aesthete and I enjoy my own space. I enjoy my own time. I feel like I'm able to bring meaning to my life simply through acts of self-creation, whereas it seems most people are not capable of doing that. They want to lose themselves in some kind of big collective project. Can't relate, but okay, I'm happy for the...
But then you take my 75% chance of winning if we used to go one-on-one and then add 66 and 2/3%.
So I don't know. So I guess what annoys me about male loneliness discourse is it often feels like yet another way to complain that women aren't taking care of men, that it's women's fault that men aren't lonely because women need to be more nurturing. My view is that men should learn to nurture themselves. All this manosphere slop presents itself as a solution to the masculine crisis of identity, but it always ends up just doubling down on exactly the tendencies that make men lonely, like the need to assert dominance, supposedly a feature of real men. I don't know, couldn't the inability to form relationships with other people that are not based on dominance and control be a factor in loneliness? Or the view of heterosexual relationships as a strict moral hierarchy, with the children at the bottom, and above children the wife, and above the wife the husband, and above the husband Christ, right? Like Christ is cut, right? So is man's head in the men, right? So man is, I don't know, right? Like when one's gonna listen, it's fine. Okay, what am I doing? I forgot. At the top you got Jesus, then the man, then the woman. Jesus cucks the man mug the woman. Jesus dominates the man dominates the woman, and the woman dominates the children. At the top you've got Jesus, and Jesus tops the man tops the woman, and the woman tops the kids. But if Jesus isn't a... If Jesus is... why would you need a series of small umbrellas under a big umbrella? What is this diagram saying? You know what sounds lonely to me? Being in a relationship with someone who's categorically lesser than you in some divine moral hierarchy. To overgeneralize a bit, I feel like women are often socialized to care for others and to prioritize the needs of others. Right? This is what we're calling nurturance. A positive effect of that for women is that women develop the skills that make it easier to sustain relationships. If you only value dominance and not nurturance, then yeah, you're probably going to be lonely. Like, I don't know, do you want to be a cowboy or not? The cowboy rides off into the sunset alone. Solitude itself is such a part of traditional masculine values. What do these people want? Do you want to be a cowboy or do you want to have a thriving social life? Pick a side. There are, of course, downsides to women's nurturance role. Taken too far, it results in a tendency to self-martyr, to not prioritize your own well-being. It's that tendency the concept of self-care is supposed to mitigate. But the problem is men also cannot self-care. They can't nurture themselves, and they expect women to do it. So you got these men who can't do their own laundry and don't think they need to clean their apartment or own furniture. I don't think men like living this way. I think they just don't realize how much work women are doing until there's not a woman doing the work. But if men value self-reliance so much, why can't they also learn to self-nurture? Stop waiting for a nagging mother wife to do your fucking laundry. Unironically, clean your room, bucko. It always comes back to that. Become your own mother wife. That is my advice for men. I guess what I'm saying is men would be better served by developing a more androgynous skill set. But that's transsexual lib talk. It's what they want you to think. It's Jewish propaganda designed by the Matrix to castrate the Western male. Part 5. A contribution to leftist infighting. So everyone hates liberals. Conservatives hate liberals, obviously, but leftists also hate liberals, and liberals even kind of hate liberals. And this is an oversimplification in the extreme, but one explanation for why everyone hates liberals that I would like to propose is that liberals are not daddy. And because liberals are not daddy, liberal politicians inspire very little in the way of reverence, loyalty, respect, or fear. So whereas the entire right-wing half of the political spectrum, despite all their various infighting and disagreements, when it comes down to it and it's time to vote, they all get behind Trump. Right-wing podcasts and YouTube channels and TV networks, from center-right conservatives to the new Aryan nation, neo-Nazi maniacs, they all line up behind Generalissimo Trump at the moments it really matters. I would estimate that a majority of left-wing content creators online spend more time hating Democrats than they do hating Republicans. Choose your favorite leftist podcast bro's Twitter account. Months into the second Trump administration, he's still ranting and raving about Joe Biden. I sometimes feel like I alone am a truly dedicated DNC shill. I guess I'm bitter about this because I felt so fucking alone in 2024 trying to tell people to vote for Kamala Harris. A popular leftist slogan online goes, "Scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds." I have actually not found that to be the case. In fact, I'm somewhat tempted to throw the allegation back at leftists. In fact, my experience for the last 9 years is that the only people who were consistently able to accurately estimate how dangerous Trump was were the people called resistance libs. And I suppose that's what I am, a resistance lib. While the far left has often maintained either that both parties are essentially the same, or even that Trump is good because he'll create a crisis that will trigger a socialist revolution. Now, people are going to accuse me of punching left, and I agree, it's always wrong to criticize people who are further left than you, unless they deserve it, which they often do. I guess it's just hard for me to avoid the suspicion sometimes that a lot of leftists tacitly prefer Trumpists to liberals. Sometimes it's not even tacit, as in the case of Slavoj Žižek, who in 2016 went so far as to say he would have voted for Trump over Hillary had he been American.
Back in November, you did say if you were American, you'd vote for Trump because the alternative, Hillary, was even worse. I mean, why did an avowed Marxist?
Because my hope was precisely that if Trump is elected president, everyone will be shocked, horrified at this horror, and something will happen, like Bernie Sanders and so on.
Yeah, that worked out really great. And Žižek, who in many ways I otherwise admire, is not even the worst example, but I'll use him as the example to avoid starting drama with other more online people. Žižek's position in 2016 was that Hillary is the establishment vote.
I never trusted this absolute obsession with Trump. Oh, now we should be all together just to stop Trump. For this, we sacrificed Bernie Sanders. This is how Hillary got us. Hillary is not just LGBT rights, a little bit more progressive. Hillary is today the vote of the establishment.
And Trump would actually shake things up, and also he would be so bad that there would be socialism maybe, and it would like revitalize the American left, and then we'd finally get Bernie Sanders in 2020. Zizek, like the average male leftist, also can't seem to avoid complaining all the time that liberals are too politically correct with their pronouns and their women.
Of course, you can in this way defend gay rights, the exclusion of LGBT people, and so on. But then, what would prevent white Aryans or whatever, white power people to say, sorry guys, but we are hurt if you attack us like this, and so on?
Every time Zizek talks about Trump, he always clarifies that, of course, he thinks Trump is horrible. Of course. Terrible. However,
of course, Trump is almost, but not quite, proto-fascist phenomenon, but I am horrified at Trump. He's a catastrophe. But what we should never forget,
as Zizek himself might put it, he knows very well that Trump is horrible. But nevertheless, it's not just Zizek. Not at all. The entire concept of the dirtbag left is basically built on this position, right? The dirtbag left means like economically left, anti-capitalist, populist, but also not politically correct. They still want to say slurs, they still want to call people regards, they want to tell feminists to shut the fuck up, and it's the Jews. It's always going to be the Jews. As long as I've run this YouTube channel, I've noticed that de-radicalized fascists are not really de-radicalized. They are often just re-radicalized into communism or anarchism. And there does seem to be some level of interchangeability between extreme ideologies. And sometimes it goes the other direction. Mussolini was a Marxist before switching to fascism. Sometimes I cringe to think that I'm basically the left-wing version of Jordan Peterson. In other words, Jordan Peterson is a conventional conservative whose viewers become fascists. And I don't want my viewers to become communists, I want them to become liberals. But my videos, despite my best efforts, are apparently very useful recruitment tools for communism. What the far left and the far right have in common, among other things, is a shared emphasis on populist rage. And there's a common idea on the left that the populist rage of Trumpists is a sentiment that could and should be harnessed by leftists.
At least part of the Trump support and Bernie Sanders support draw from the same source of popular rage. And I think the ultimate reason of Trump's success is the failure of the left to capitalize on this popular rage.
I have come to think that this stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of populist rage, which leftists assume is 1, just, and 2, the effect of oppression. And I used to assume that too. It's common sense, right? That anger at the establishment would be proportionate to the oppression of the establishment. But what if common sense is wrong? What if populist rage is sometimes just ambient sadism directed at convenient targets? Bernie Sanders said that Trump won the 2024 election because he, quote, validated people's pain. And that is a very charitable interpretation of the motivations of Trump voters. So charitable as to border on being dishonest. Because Trump is not out here saying, your pain is valid. I see you. No, he says these animals are spilling across the border from insane asylums and they're poisoning the blood of our country. It's very sad. Obviously, fascists resent outgroup scapegoats more than they resent the people actually exploiting them. But what if it's not just fascists who do that? What if it's people in general? Hannah Arendt cites Alexis de Tocqueville's observation that during the Revolution, French aristocrats were resented more when they lost power. Because it's not oppression that was resented, it's the appearance of useless wealth. Why did the French Revolution happen when it did? Is it because Louis XVI was a more oppressive king than Louis XIV or Louis XIII? No. Kind of the opposite, in fact. Louis XVI was, well, not a liberal because he's still a king. You can't really be a liberal king, but he blinked in a staring contest with the Enlightenment. He convened the Estates General, which gave the people a voice. And that's always a mistake. If you're a monarch who wants to continue being a monarch, don't give the people a voice. Don't let the people say what they want. You are the monarch. You tell the people what they want. If you start letting them tell you what they want, well, you may as well just cut your own head off now. Obviously, the causes of any revolution are extremely complicated and range from the psychological to the economic to the geographical. Like, it's all very complicated. But to the extent that Louis XVI's personality and rule contributed to the French Revolution, it was not him being an especially oppressive king that led to the revolution. It was more that he was perceived as a weak king, a neurospicy cuckold. Likewise, the Russian Revolution followed military defeats in the Russo-Japanese War, World War I, and Tsar Nicholas II, another perceived cuckold who couldn't even whip his wife into obedience, much less his people, looked weak. People don't just revolt against leaders because they're oppressive, they revolt because they think they can get away with it. Many of the most oppressive leaders in world history never had a revolution. Hitler survived dozens of assassination attempts, but there was no revolution in Nazi Germany. Stalin, Papa Stalin, the father of nations. There was no revolution against Stalin because Stalin was a real man who beat his wife and beat his children and beat his people into submission. And people don't revolt against someone like that because people wouldn't dare. I mean, look what he did to Trotsky. Do you want to risk that? Maybe a revolution is just a nation's way of replacing a weak leader with a strong leader. Maybe the French Revolution didn't climax with Robespierre, but with Napoleon. Maybe the Russian Revolution was just the people's way of replacing a cuckold czar with a daddy Stalin. So no, Trump is not the best thing to happen to leftism in the United States. Trump's regime will not trigger a socialist revolution. I think the chances of a socialist revolution happening in the United States in the foreseeable future are very, very close to zero, but if anything, I think it's more likely to happen during the reign of a feckless lib than during the rule of someone like Trump. Look at leftist protesters. They love to heckle the Democrats because they know the Democrats will put up with it. Leftist protesters don't go to Trump rallies because they wouldn't dare, because it would be dangerous. They could deport you. They could beat you up right there in the stadium. For most people, daddy is their first model of authority. And for many people, daddy is the lifelong model for legitimate authority. Most people learn early in childhood that there's a futility in rebelling against daddy. Attacking power is dangerous because power retaliates. So violence and aggression are usually directed instead against people who can't or won't retaliate. And that's why substitute victims, scapegoats, are chosen from classes with less power. See, for example, J.K. Rowling's displacement of aggression from abusive men, from her father, from her abusive ex-husband, onto trans people, to trans women in particular. Scapegoats are also usually outsiders, people who are external to the metaphorical family. You don't kill your father, right? In childhood, we learn to repress aggression toward the father who punishes, and we learn to, in general, suppress aggression toward paternal patriarchal authorities. We transfer it outside the family, onto dark mommy, onto the deviants, the illegals, the vicious snake. And power is often attributed to the scapegoats, but in an insincere way. Conspiracists know on some level that Satanists don't really control the world, that most Democrats are not pedophiles, but believing that they are justifies the violence. It's a difficult aspect of mass psychology to grapple with. The Western philosophical tradition of freedom and reason and individualism is inherently in tension with the underlying daddy politics of the masses. I'm this close to making Aristotle's argument about democracy containing the seeds of its own destruction. And what are we supposed to make of that? Well, I don't know. Being a mother is a dirty, thankless job, but it's a job liberals have chosen for ourselves. Tangent, generations. Part 1, Skibbity Toilet. A couple months ago, a TikTok went viral of a 9-year-old singing a song that would become known as Sticking Out Your Gyat for the Rizzler. Let's take a moment to listen to the primary text.
Sticking out your gyat for the Rizzler. You're so skibbity. You're so phantom tax. I just wanna be your Sigma. Freaking come here. Give me your Ohio.
This clip went viral seemingly among Gen Alphas, that is babies, who thought that the song was funny, and also among Gen Z and millennial people who feel very attacked by this song. Let's read some comments people left on re-uploads of this on YouTube. I feel like an 80-year-old man after hearing this. This makes me feel like an out-of-touch 103-year-old World War II veteran. I have now lost all hope for the future of humanity. What's going on here? Is this really so horrifying? If you're not chronically online and incapable of logging off, I may well be the first person who's telling you that any of this even exists. And if that's the case, why don't we go through the entire song right now, and I'll explain Gen Alpha terminology so that everyone is on the same page. Line 1, sticking out your gyat for the Rizzler.
Sticking out your gyat for the Rizzler.
Okay, gyat and Rizzler. Gyat is just AAVE, African American Vernacular English. It means God, as in gyat damn. But in this context, gyat means butt, because that's what it means to white children who misunderstood AAVE, as they often do. Some white child heard gyat damn and, by Mixolydian associations,
Baby got back.
assumed that it meant butt. So white infants are misunderstanding and appropriating AAVE. Okay, business as usual. Rizzler. Riz is the middle syllable of charisma. Riz approximately means game in pickup artist lingo. If Riz means game, charisma, then the Rizzler is one whomst possesses such qualities. Line 2. You're so skibbity.
You're so skibbity.
Skibbity is a reference to the popular internet series Skibbity Toilet. Let's take a look at the primary text.
My style is ridiculous.
Skibbity Toilet videos got hundreds of millions of views on TikTok and YouTube last year, mostly because they are watched by children who find this kind of thing funny, and the default reaction to this from millennials and Gen Z seems to be fear, terror, intimidation. But I see no reason for these reactions. In fact, I have watched Skibbity Toilet. I spent hours, days even, watching, studying really, Skibbity Toilet, and I think that I can explain why 9-year-olds think Skibbity Toilet is funny. Skibbity Toilet is funny because a man's head pops out of a toilet. This is unexpected, it's crass even, and such things are often among the culture of 9-year-olds considered to be humorous. Does anyone remember being 9 years old? Do you remember what people thought was funny when you were 9? Toilets, underpants, when the poopy comes out of the butt. When I was 9, there was this book series called Captain Underpants that were passed around my elementary school and considered the absolute height of comedy. I think it's strange that people are so fast to forget what it was like to be a child. One comment on sticking out your gyat for the Rizzler says, if you said all this to our ancestors hundreds of years ago, they would probably die on the spot from an aneurysm. I could not disagree more. In fact, I see Skibbity Toilet as continuing a nonsense tradition of English lyricism beginning with Renaissance madrigals in the 16th century.
We're here to hurt nobody.
Often the nonsense syllables imply something crude, something crass. In the 20th century, nonsense was a frequently occurring element in pop music lyricism. I really want to zig-a-zig ah. Is it really so hard to understand? It's Jabberwocky, the inherent fun of nonsense. I, for one, welcome our new Sigma Lords. Line 3. You're so phantom tax.
You're so phantom tax.
Phantom tax is an in-joke created by the streamer Phantom. When someone has food and Phantom takes a portion of that food, this act constitutes the eponymous tax.
Mom? You locking doors in this house? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Wrong with you?
Line 4. I just want to be your Sigma.
I just want to be your Sigma.
A Sigma male is manosphere nonsense. It just means alpha male, but with more steps. I don't love it, but is this worse than millennials? Is this worse than anything Gen Z has done? No. 9. And if Gen Alpha is going around talking about Sigma males, well, whose fault is that? Who taught them this? They didn't come up with it themselves. I think what's going on with this moral panic about sticking out your gyat for the Rizzler and Skibbity Toilet is that Gen Z is now old enough to conceptualize themselves as aging. So people in their, We will talk later about what constitutes Gen Z, but people who are entering their mid-20s often kind of begin for the first time to sort of grasp their own mortality, and there's a level of angst that comes with that. You realize that there's this like youth culture coming up behind you that you're not a part of, that you don't recognize, and that kind of triggers these feelings about the passage of time, about your own eventual aging and irrelevance. This is something I think millennials have gotten pretty comfortable with by now. Millennials at this stage have entered middle age. We know that we're no longer the youth culture, although I do think there's something off about the way we currently categorize recent generations, because it seems to me that it was only 5 years ago that I really started hearing millennial discourse about how Gen Z is doomed and how the kids aren't okay. It can't possibly be the case. There's only 5 years dividing one generation from the next. So something's going a little off here. For millennials, the generational panic set in. Honestly, it was only 4 years ago. It was like 2020. Some Gen Z person called skinny jeans chuggy and said that you should part your hair in the center instead of on the side. And a lot of millennial women kind of lost their shit.
Gen Z's trying to what? Cancel Eminem. One day you'll grow up and see how everyone went and forgot about Z.
You can pry these skinny jeans from my cold dead ass, you hear? So Gen Z, you can suck it. You can't tell me what to wear.
Yes, we're all slowly dying. Take your Lexapro and get over it. Part 2, identity and categorization. So why do we categorize people by generation at all? I think some of the appeal is similar to astrology, right? People always want to know, who am I? Where do I belong? And generations provide one answer to that question. The practice of naming each generation, millennials, Gen Z, boomers, that actually only began in the 20th century, with Gertrude Stein allegedly coining the phrase the lost generation to refer to the generation that came of age during World War I. Many of the men of that generation died in the war, and its impact was devastating. So the generation was lost. Generation theorists have subsequently gone back and named generations going back to like the 15th century, but this was not a practice of those centuries. It didn't begin until about 100 years ago. Boomers probably had a big impact on the longevity of this discourse because boomers as a generation had a very strong generational consciousness. It's something that comes across in a lot of the music from around 1970, such as the song My Generation by The Who.
I hope I die before I get old. Talking about my generation.
I hope I die before I get old. Roger Daltrey, the lead singer of The Who, as of the time I'm making this video, is 80 years old and very much alive. There's a lot of ironies like that with boomers. As a generation, so to generalize, they had a very strong sense of generational consciousness and a very oppositional attitude towards older generations. Don't trust anyone over 30 was a popular boomer slogan, which is very funny in light of the fact that boomers would later have a very oppositional attitude towards younger generations. They think I forgot about The Who, and they think I forgot about don't trust anyone over 30. Well, joke's on you, boomers. I will see to it that you outlive Applebee's. So I think the continued popularity of generations discourse, as with a lot of things, can be squarely blamed on the boomers. It can also probably be blamed on a business or corporate use of generation discourse. I know that people who work in marketing spend a lot of time studying generational patterns because they are investigating how to market to different age groups and how to predict future trends. The generation wars, as my generation, millennials, knows them, began in the early 2010s when a vast armada of articles blaming millennials for destroying Applebee's, wasting money on avocado toast, being lazy and whiny and unable to get a job, appeared in newspapers and publications all over the internet. More recently, a lot of the online discourse about generations is mostly taking the form of feuding between Gen Z and millennials, these little clashes over skinny jeans, hair parting, millennials being cringe infantile adults who complain about adulting and continue to categorize themselves as Harry Potter houses.
I'm a female millennial, which means I've been diagnosed with the anxieties.
Millennials, in turn, being extremely upset that Gen Z is canceling M&M or eating Tide Pods. In the last couple years, Gen Z has now decided to start acting like grumpy old people, accusing alphas of being doomed iPad kids. A lot of surprisingly vicious debate takes place over where to draw the boundaries between generations. The Pew Research Center lists 1996 as the dividing point between millennials and Gen Z, but for some reason a lot of people born in the late 90s or early 2000s are extremely insistent that they are millennials and not Gen Z. Some of this seems to have to do with people not wanting to identify with what is perceived as a negative generational stereotype. So people born in Y2K are saying, I never ate Tide Pods, I'm not like that, okay, I must be a millennial, which kind of raises the question of, is what we're doing here just stereotyping? I think it's a little more than just stereotyping. I think the idea of talking about generations as a persona or some kind of collective archetype, I feel like it makes at least a little bit of sense in that people of an age cohort will tend to have certain shared experiences in common. So if you're a millennial, then you presumably remember at least a little bit of the 20th century. You were a child when 9/11 happened, and you came of age around the time of the 2008 financial crisis, and you were you were moving into mid-adulthood at the time of the COVID pandemic. So things like this occurring at a certain age in your life leaves a kind of distinct imprint, I guess, is the idea on each cohort, which justifies the use of this sort of generational stereotype. Though on the internet, it's often not major social and political events that are used as the signposts for generations, but instead these little collections of media franchises and categories of objects that people use, these little generational collages that are supposed to invoke, I suppose, a memory of being a certain age during a particular period of time. A top post on the Generationology subreddit splits the 2010s into two halves, using logos of social media sites, memes, TV shows, icons of various apps, game consoles, and I guess presidents too, to represent different generational experiences of this time period, I guess. Marking time on the internet often involves a fixation on objects, design styles, operating systems, phones, CDs, game consoles, fashion. I guess it probably says something that these are taken to be the defining experiences of a generation. Do you remember when consumerism was a thing that was critiqued? That was very big in the 90s and the 2000s. Critiquing consumerism. Well, consumerism won. What defines a millennial? I feel like I see PlayStation mentioned more often than 9/11. I blame Invader Zim. Do you remember the show Invader Zim, which got very popular with like a Hot Topic kind of crowd in the early 2000s? There was a planet in Invader Zim that was all one giant food court. I feel like teenagers who made Invader Zim their entire personality made critiquing consumerism cringe. It's also very revealing of how United States-centric this entire discourse usually is. Often these discourses carry on seemingly without any awareness of the fact that there are countries where the defining event for 12-year-olds in the year 2000 was not, in fact, the release of the PlayStation 2. So not only is a lot of this discourse US-centric, it's often stereotypical to the point that even a very minor deviation from the norm of your generation will make you feel like you don't identify with it at all. Even something as small as being gay, I feel like takes you out of the core of the generational stereotype. We're often very content to talk about boomers as if they were all hippies in the late 60s and early 70s, but that is in fact not the case. Hippie was a subculture. It was a small minority of people. We see Gen X as disaffected nihilists who watch MTV and The Simpsons and listen to Nirvana. We see millennials as the children of helicopter parents, infantile, quirky, cutesy behavior that lasts well into your 30s, adulting, heckin' small beans, doggo puppers.
I'm so excited that Taylor Swift gets to be small girl with Travis Kelce because he is large boy and she gets to be small girl. He can just scoop her up. She's not gonna be the monster. No, she gets to be small girl.
I think most people will reject the stereotype of their generation, or at least they will not personally identify with that stereotype. But you could argue that the awareness of the stereotype becomes part of the kind of collective sensibility of the generation, where even if you're a boomer and you never identified with hippies and you thought it was all narcissistic nonsense, like you still sort of define yourself in some ways as against the image of your generation. I definitely think that that's the case. Like we all kind of contend with the stereotype of our generation, and it enters into our own identity. Another reason I think that the generational stereotype tends not to add up is that the culture of one generation is often derived from the artists of the previous generation. So if you define baby boomers in the traditional way as beginning with births in 1945, then you would have to exclude from the baby boomer generation such people as Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, all of whom were born in the early 40s and would by traditional definitions be considered the silent generation. So there is something kind of arbitrary about the way these lines are drawn, right? We're trying to impose order on chaos. And I'm especially suspicious of the way that the lines are being drawn between millennials and Gen Z and Gen Alpha. It's very difficult to do history while the history is being made. And I sometimes wonder if millennials and Gen Z really are two generations at all. There's a narcissism of small differences that characterizes the feuding between millennials and Gen Z. It's more like sibling rivalry than it is like conflict between parents and their children. So we need to move beyond memes and stereotypes in order for this discourse to actually be meaningful. So let's look at what academic theorists of generations have said about this. I did read actual books for this tangent, so why don't we talk about those? Part 3, the Strauss-Howe theory. When it comes to academic theorizing about generations, the big names that usually come up are William Strauss and Neil Howe, authors of several books on the topic, beginning with Generations in 1991 and The Fourth Turning in 1997. Strauss and Howe coined the term millennials, so you know they're a big deal in this conversation. Strauss and Howe present a systematic account of a generational cycle in American history, which they seem to also think could be applied to other societies, though they focus on the US. They basically suggest that history repeats according to a cycle called a saeculum, which is an ancient Roman term that refers to a period of time approximately equal to a long human life. So about 80 to 100 years is a saeculum. A saeculum can be divided into 4 seasons or turnings, which also occur in a regular cycle. So the analogy is spring, summer, autumn, winter. But the 4 seasons of human generations are the high season, or turning is their term, the high turning, the awakening turning, the unraveling, and the crisis. Each turning lasts 20 to 25 years, and if we were to analyze the last saeculum, this begins with the high following World War II, the post-war economic boom that gave way to the awakening of the late 60s and 70s. So that would be the kind of hippie consciousness revolution, as well as the kind of born-again evangelical fanaticism of the 1980s. The unraveling period would be the 90s and 2000s, so in particular I should think 9/11, the war in Iraq, and the crisis begins in 2008 with the economic crash, and this is my editorializing a little bit, but I would imagine this also includes the Trump presidency, culminating in the January 6th insurrection, and of course the COVID pandemic. The idea seems to be that there's a major crisis in American history, approximately 80 years. So beginning with the Revolutionary War to the Civil War, that's one saeculum, 2 crises. Then you have the Civil War to the Great Depression and World War II, that was the last crisis. And then it's been about 80 years from World War II to 2020, the coronavirus pandemic, the January 6th insurrection, the most recent crisis. These are very bold, sweeping claims, so I think some level of skepticism here is warranted, but I'm going to try to present the idea first, and then we'll consider if any of this is actually true. Strauss and Howe argued that for each of the 4 seasons or turnings, there is a kind of generational archetype defined by the age a generation is, or rather the season when a generation comes of age. The 4 archetypes are prophet, nomad, hero, and artist. So a prophet generation are born during the high and come of age during the awakening. So that would be boomers, for example. They're born in the post-World War II high, and they came of age during the consciousness revolution. A nomad generation is born during the awakening and comes of age during the unraveling. So this would be Gen X, born during the 60s and 70s and coming of age during the 90s and 2000s. A hero generation is born during the unraveling and comes of age during the crisis. So this would be the GI generation who came of age during World War II, or millennials who were born during the 80s and 90s and came of age during the 2008 economic crisis and the coronavirus pandemic. And lastly, an artist generation is born during the crisis and comes of age during the high. So this would be the silent generation, people born during the Great Depression and World War II, or some combination of Gen Z and Gen Alpha. Strauss and Howe actually share my earlier criticism of the way that millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha are popularly defined. Neil Howe actually thinks that millennials began in the kind of mid-80s and end in 2005, which is very late. I think most people consider the early 2000s as Gen Z. So if you're one of those Gen Z cusp people who thinks that you were born in 1999, therefore you're millennial, Neil Howe actually agrees with you. Strauss and Howe call Gen Z the Homelander generation. And I think that also the people we're now calling Gen Alpha would also be included in that generation. So you can map out Strauss and Howe's model on a kind of chart that shows on one axis the seasons or turnings, high, awakening, unraveling, crisis. And on the other axis, you have stages of life. So elders, midlife, young adulthood, and childhood. During each historical season, you have what Strauss and Howe call a constellation. So that would be the particular arrangement of generational archetypes that is at a given age at whatever time. This sounds very abstract, but I think that you can kind of make it make more sense by envisioning it in a specific time period. So a major event like the Great Depression, let's say, will have kind of a different effect on different generations that are alive to experience it. So I think we all kind of intuitively understand this. If you're American, you probably have heard stories about your grandparents or your great-grandparents sort of stockpiling food and sort of displaying a kind of neurosis, a generational neurosis that came about as a result of growing up in this time of extreme deprivation. And, you know, people who were young adults during that time, they're sort of for life, they are affected by it. Strauss and Howe use this model to describe what they call the generational diagonal, which basically describes the path any given generation takes through the 4 turnings or seasons. So for example, take a hero generation like millennials who are born during the unraveling. Millennials will be children during the unraveling. They will come into young adulthood during the crisis. They will reach midlife during the high, and they will be elders during the awakening. The argument is that we can expect millennials to have a very different life path and a kind of different generational persona at each stage of life than, say, a prophet generation like boomers, who are children during the high, come of age during the awakening, midlife during the unraveling, and are elders during the crisis. This is an important point because it means that it is wrong to make sweeping conclusions about what old people are like or what teenagers are like on the basis of any given concurrent generational personae. Their cyclical model of history urges us to look instead at the diagonal movement across the 4 turnings. So if you want to know what millennials are going to be like as elders, you should not look at the current boomer elders. Millennials won't be anything like that. Instead, you should look at the last hero generation. So that would be the GI generation. And Strauss and Howe suggest that millennials will act in certain ways with a similar personality to GI elders when millennials are elders. If you instead use a linear model to predict generational personality developments, then you will make bad predictions about the future. So the example that Strauss and Howe give is a kind of Tomorrowland view of the future that someone like Walt Disney came up with during the 1950s, right? Or the Jetsons. You just kind of imagine the 50s, but in the future. The assumption of linear models of history is usually that the future will be like today, but more so. Strauss and Howe's cyclical model argues that this is wrong. If you want to predict the future, don't look at today and extrapolate based on current trends. Instead, take the cyclical view. Look at what was going on 60 years ago, and that will give you a better idea of what's going to be going on in 20 years, both in terms of the kind of historical mood of the country and also of the generational personality of a given age range. I find this argument to be pretty illuminating about a kind of mistake I feel like I've made a lot in my own thinking, which is to kind of assume that teenagers are always going to be a certain way. And I feel like I have an idea of what young people are supposed to do that is very influenced by Gen X disaffection and boomer visionary awakening. For example, I found myself being a little bit surprised and kind of disappointed in some of the behavior of younger millennials and Gen Z. Like, my stereotype of Gen Z is that they're very uptight, conformist, cautious, not rebellious, not experimental. In short, they don't do drugs and they don't fuck. They listen to Billie Eilish, they make TikToks. I feel like a big contrast between millennials and Gen Z is that millennials acted very immature for our age. Most millennials were raised by boomers, and millennials who are kind of in the middle or older part of the generation, such as myself, you know, we were teenagers before the 2008 economic crash. So this is actually something that I notice is a difference between me and even my youngest sibling, who's only 5 years younger than me, is in 2008, when the economy crashed, I was 18, which means that I got through adolescence basically being told that the world was going to be completely different than the way it turned out. Like, I was raised by boomer parents and told these very like kind of idealistic boomerish things about what I needed to do as a teenager. I was kind of told, oh, you can be anything you want to be. Don't worry about money. Just like follow your passions. My parents were economically secure, so that is not going to be a universal generational thing. But I think that it is a generational thing even within that economic bracket, because my youngest sibling was very much not given the advice that it doesn't, money doesn't matter. Like, because he was a teenager after the economy crashed. So he came of age with a very pragmatic, okay, I need to make money. I need to pursue a profession. I cannot go to music school, right? It's a big difference between me and my youngest sibling, is that I went to music school and I did all this kind of indulgent stuff that a more pragmatic person would not do, because I was raised with this kind of wide-eyed optimism about the future. That optimism collapsed in 2008. And even someone 5 years younger than me shows the difference of that. And Gen Z's stereotypes about millennials tend to be that we are infantile, that we're young for our age, that we can't grow up properly. We're sort of obnoxious and babyish, and we talk about hashtag adulting.
I'm a female millennial, which means I've been diagnosed with the anxieties.
Whereas people 10 or 15 years younger than me, my experience of them is that they act older than they are. They kind of conceptualize themselves as adults very, very young. Like, as soon as they got out of high school, they were thinking, oh God, what is my career? How am I going to make money? How am I going to pay rent? There's this kind of anxiety that they had from go that I didn't have, right? I got to have these first 18 years that were kind of head in the clouds. So it's wrong to assume that sex and drugs is what young people do. Sex and drugs are not always what young people do. It's what boomers do, right? Not young people. Young people aren't really having sex and doing drugs anymore. Does that mean that sex and drugs aren't cool anymore? Or does it mean that today's young people aren't cool? Honestly, we can't lay this all on Gen Z. I think millennials started this, because millennials did do drugs, but most millennials did them in a very uncool way. Millennials killed drugs, is what I'm saying here. Listen to the way my generation and younger talk about drugs. I microdose psilocybin because it helps with my anxiety.
I've been diagnosed with the anxieties.
My anxiety. What is it with my generation and anxiety? Millennials and Gen Z, they all have anxiety. What is it? What is the deal with that? Boomers do not have anxiety. The silent generation did not have anxiety, but every single millennial and every single Gen Z person has anxiety. And you see a similar difference in attitudes towards sex. I feel like when I was young, I assumed that, oh, young people like sex and old people hate sex, because that's the kind of stereotype that I picked up from Gen X and boomers, who kind of transmitted the stereotype down to me. But today's young people don't like sex. I can't remember the last time I saw sex positive used in a non-derogatory way. But of course, if you think about history, that makes sense. Young people have not always been super pro-sex. Think about Mao's Red Guards or Orwell's Junior Anti-Sex League. There's nothing about being a young person that makes you inherently sexual liberationist, right? It's not youth that's pro-sex, it's boomers. They're the ones that were pro-sex. It's similar to how things that seem to have a very fixed position in the culture war turn out to be much more politically mobile than you would expect. No one would have guessed that the left would get the NFL in the divorce. Health food, hippie nature worship, fear about chemicals. In the 70s, this kind of stuff would seem solidly in the far left category. But today, there's granola fascism all over the timeline. Ooh, that'd be a good tangent topic. Granola fascism. I've even seen predictions that Christianity will become associated with the left as the right becomes more quote-unquote Nietzschean. So one positive thing I will say about Strauss and Howe's seasonal theory is I think it can give us compassion for different generations by teaching us not to expect that generations will act the same as the ones immediately before or after. Though I do think there are some consistencies. Like, for a long time, decades and decades, the older generation has thought the younger are illiterate, are addicted to technology, have no attention span, and are generally a sign of humanity's doom. I remember when I was a tiny baby in the 90s, adults would constantly complain about the boob tube, which is what they called TV, and they thought it was destroying our attention span and making us illiterate. When I was a teenager, the exact same things were being said about computers and social media and then smartphones, and now even Gen Z is saying these old person talking points about the alphas and about TikTok. Likewise, I think pretty much every young generation in some way thinks that the older generation is irrelevant and out of touch and holding back the youth. And I think a lot of the consistent dynamic of young-old resentments are born of a kind of envy. So older generations envy the young their youth, beauty, novelty, agility, their distance from death, and the young envy the old power, prestige, skill, experience, expertise, confidence, wisdom, self-knowledge, the kind of stability of identity that comes with age and experience. All of that stuff I think is constant, but a lot of other things are variable. The question though is that variability accurately described by Strauss and Howe's model? Or is this astrology? Is it Hogwarts houses? If we bring up Strauss and Howe's chart of the generational diagonals, we see that a hero generation will be protected in youth, heroic in young adulthood, powerful at midlife, and civic in elderhood. Whereas a prophet generation will be indulged in youth, visionary in young adulthood, moralistic at midlife, and wise in old age. Doesn't this sound an awful lot like a horoscope? A Sagittarius generation will be suffocated at youth, sensitive in young adulthood, indecisive in midlife, and empathetic in elderhood. Whereas a Libra generation will be abandoned in youth, alienated in young adulthood, pragmatic in midlife, and tough in elderhood. Look, I'm not just going to sit here and pretend that that's not a horoscope. Part 4. The Shape of Time. So if I am somewhat skeptical about Strauss and Howe's generational archetype horoscope, I do like a lot of things about their theory, and one of the things I like is their cyclical view of history. I think that history is storytelling, and in some sense, we kind of can't help but impose some shape on things. And a linear, progressive, evolutionary view of history is so common and so standard that I find it really refreshing to see someone analyzing not just generations, but history in general in terms of cycles, which to me is a much more intuitive way to understand time. Comparing linear versus cyclical versions of historical storytelling reminds me of that Kurt Vonnegut lecture where he talks about different story shapes. So you have Cinderella, which starts at the very bottom and then gradually climbs up to infinity. And you have what Vonnegut calls man in hole. You start out doing well, and then you fall in the hole, and then you get out of the hole, and everything's good again. I'm tempted to say that each of these kind of storytelling shapes is a way that we impose order on chaos, but I think even saying we impose order on chaos still kind of assumes that there is a kind of metaphysical truth of history. It's just saying that chaos is that truth, right? So chaos is one other story shape that we could take. In fact, it's one of the three that Strauss and Howe list as possibilities: chaotic history, linear history, or cyclical history. If we're going to study history not just as a series of random facts, but as some kind of coherent story, then we kind of have to assume some kind of shape to the story that we're telling. A lot of reactionaries or fascists, they kind of do use the man in hole story, right? There is a past golden age, Eden, the Roman Empire, and then there was a fall, the degeneracy, the decadence, and then that's going to be restored again in the second coming, the glorious new Reich, right? The Christian account of history is also kind of man in whole, right? There was Eden, and then there was the fall, and then there will be the last judgment, and that's good, actually. Yay! The chaotic view is associated with theorists that were called postmodern. So famously, the French theorist Lyotard said that, quote, simplifying to the extreme, I define postmodern as incredulity toward meta-narratives. In other words, a kind of skepticism about the possibility of telling any kind of big story about human history. Lyotard was reacting to the modernist tendency to tell linear evolutionist stories, which we associate with Hegel or with Marx, and more recently with Francis Fukuyama, who wrote the infamous book, The End of History, which proposes that liberal democracy is kind of the final consensus form of government. Or more recently, Steven Pinker wrote a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, which tells a kind of linear evolutionist history where violence has been decreasing. Cyclical time, like what Strauss and Howe are proposing, is a little bit foreign to Western historiography, but I say that it's intuitive because I think that human perception of time originates in cycles, both cosmic cycles and physiological ones. So cosmic cycles would be like day and night, lunar cycles, astrological cycles, and physiological cycles would be obvious ones like the menstrual cycle, the circadian rhythm, but also a heartbeat, which is a cycle of diastole and systole. The rise and fall of breathing is a kind of cycle, the tension and release of sexual response, and the seasonal cycle of a human lifespan, right? Childhood, youth, midlife, and old age. Strauss and Howe point out that the number 4 is traditionally considered a feminine symbol because it is associated with cycles. The 4 seasons, the last of which leads into the first, the 4 weeks of a month in certain calendar systems, right? This is contrasted with the number 3, which is traditionally masculine. I guess because 3 is a triad, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, that leads to a kind of climax, which I don't know why male sexual response is not considered cyclical. Isn't there a kind of cycle to the male phallic rise and fall as well? The Maya calendar is circular, representing a cyclical view of time, whereas our calendars are organized little charts that somewhat disguise the cycles. Technology somewhat enables us to suppress the cyclical nature of time. Strauss and Howe point out that we have electric lights, climate control, refrigeration, and medicine like stimulants and depressants that allow us to kind of fight our own natural rhythms. They argue that Christianity has deliberately suppressed the cyclical view of time associated with paganism and astrology and alchemy and the occult. Augustine says only the wicked walk in circles. I'm actually recording this tangent on Easter, a holiday that kind of uneasily sits between pagan cyclical time and Christian linear time. Easter is obviously a spring rebirth, start of a new cycle pagan holiday, but it's had the Christian view of resurrection attached to it. So the Christian view is supposed to be linear and that there is one resurrection and then a second coming. but we celebrate it once a year at a time that happens to coincide with spring and the return of the sun, the sun, as well as the son, and with the return of vegetation and crops, and that's why we have all these eggs and rabbits. So I don't know, I emotionally find that I kind of am attracted to cyclical views of time, but with any kind of theory about the shape of history, you kind of have to be a little bit skeptical, and one of the reasons is that you always end up asking, like, what is the cause? This is something that I find myself sort of unsure of with Strauss and Howe. Like, okay, there's these 4 seasons of history that repeat every 80 to 100 years, and there's these generational archetypes. Okay, but why, right? What is driving this particular cycle? I think for Strauss and Howe, the cause is something like reactivity of each generation to the one that comes before it, right? So we all kind of react to the excesses of the generation that came before us. And I guess that kind of reaction is supposed to be what makes each generation differ from the one that came before it in distinctive and repeating ways. So I don't know if that's a completely convincing explanation, but linear views of history also have trouble explaining what is causing the linear progression that they propose. I should note that there are some cyclical versions of history that I do not like. The big one being what I guess we could call the Meninist cyclical view of history. It's kind of a viral spammed YouTube comment. I'm sure you've seen it. Hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men. Weak men create hard times. So this is a cyclical view of history where the driving force is some kind of dialectic of masculinity and struggle, right? Rome fell because of decadence. And when these people say weak men, they do mean gay. They mean LGBT. And there's usually also a xenophobic idea that the US will fall, but because masculine Muslim barbarians are totally gonna ass blast the American they-them pussies, right? I don't care for this. I think Camille Paglia actually says something along these lines.
What you invariably get are people who are convinced of the power of heroic masculinity, okay, on the edges, whether they're the Vandals and the Huns, okay, or whether they're the barbarians of ISIS, okay. You see them starting to mass on the outsides of the culture. And that's what we have right now, that there is a tremendous and rather terrifying disconnect between the infatuation with the transgender movement in our own culture and what's going on out there, okay?
Sad. A better point of reference for cyclical time might be nostalgia cycles, where I think at least with nostalgia cycles, it's pretty clear that some of the things that are driving the cycle have simply to do with, like, again, it's kind of a generational thing. Like, once a generation reaches, I don't know, their mid 30s or 40s, like the generation is going to be nostalgic for things that remind them of their childhood and teenage years. And that those two things are going to cause a kind of 20 or 30 year nostalgia cycle, which is something that we definitely see in media and in marketing. Another thing I like about cyclical views of time in general is that you then don't have the awkward task of needing to explain what the line in your linear account of history is moving towards. A lot of linear evolutionary accounts of time kind of posit an end of history, which I always find kind of implausible. If we look at the big theorists of linear time, particularly Hegel and Marx, there is clearly an end that is posited. For Hegel, the linear movement of history is supposed to be this kind of rational process of spirit actualizing itself. The end of Hegel's history is absolute knowledge, I guess, which some interpreters like Fukuyama think is essentially liberal democracy. Fukuyama's interpretation of Hegel is basically that liberal democracy is supposed to be uniquely capable of fulfilling our universal desire for recognition. That is, we want to sort of be seen as human beings and recognized as human beings by this society that we live in. And in a society that gives us rights and choices, we get that recognition. Leftists hate this, obviously, because they think there needs to be a socialist stage after liberal democracy, and fascists hate it because they want ethno-national recognition. Fukuyama is very engaged with a Nietzschean critique of his own ideas, where he's arguing against this idea that, no, we don't actually want to be equal, right? We want to be special. That would be the Nietzschean critique of Fukuyama, is that people are actually not content with liberal democracy because we don't like all people being equal. There's some kind of drive to mastery within us that wants to be exceptional, and liberal democracy doesn't fulfill that need. The Marxist view is similar to Hegel, but, quote, turned on its head. So what's called historical materialism is basically the Marxist economic version of the Hegelian historical evolutionism. So Marx is saying that no, history is not a rational process of kind of ideas becoming actualized in history. Instead, Marx sees history as the history of modes of production, of class struggle. And Marx's idea of the force that drives history is that there are structural contradictions in each mode of production which lead to a social revolution and a new mode of production. Contradictions is a kind of Hegelian vestige, I think, that's in Marx, because contradictions implies that the movement of history has something to do with reason. But I think when Marx says contradictions, he really just means conflict, right? Like the conflict in capitalism is a conflict between the owning class and the labor class. And Marxists usually argue that capitalism is inherently unsustainable, that it must eventually give rise to a revolution because of these contradictions. And then usually if they follow the Marxist account, they don't think that communism will lead to anything else because I guess there's no contradictions in communism. Interesting. When I was researching this video, I also found that Marxists generally hate generational discourse. They hate this kind of cyclical stuff because they see it as an ideological distraction that detracts from the development of actual class consciousness. So my skepticism about the Strauss-Howe model is not about the cyclical aspect. I actually like that part. What I'm skeptical of is the specifics, like the idea that there's a crisis once every 80 years and that the crisis will last 20 to 25 years. In order to say this, you have to be very flexible with what counts as a crisis and what doesn't. So why, for example, is the coronavirus pandemic a legitimate crisis, but like 9/11 and the Iraq War are not a crisis? Why is the Cuban Missile Crisis not a crisis? Well, because it doesn't occur during a crisis season. Okay. That's super valid. That's so valid. Part 5, the failure of millennials. So I've been down on Marxism in this video, and I want to tell you why. Because I feel like it is something fundamental to the generational experience of being a millennial. The defining coming-of-age event for millennials is often cited as the Great Recession of 2008. And if that's the case, then our great acid wave, our anti-war movement was Occupy Wall Street, and then Bernie Sanders' democratic socialism. Let us take a moment to reflect on the failure of this. In 2016, I admit it, I supported Hillary Clinton, not because I disagreed with Bernie Sanders. I actually completely agreed with his general approach to creating a more equal economic dispensation, but I just thought it was like unpragmatic. In other words, I thought that our choice in 2016 was liberalism or barbarism. Now, it turns out that barbarism won. Well, no worries. First Trump and then us, right? I feel like we are at a historical moment when I don't see anyone else like formally acknowledging this, and I'm a little bit hesitant to do so myself, but I kind of am getting the feeling that socialism in America, I feel like it's not really happening, guys. Like, maybe eventually, but like, not in my lifetime. Like, even the OK Boomer girl said Biden 2024. It's so over. It's so over for the far left. The OK Boomer girl was the only thing holding this together.
Whatever you say, boomer.
I mean, talk about cyclical time. I feel like a depression inevitably follows a mania. And if there was a kind of mania in the 2010s corresponding to a kind of 80s nostalgia and the nostalgia cycle with those bright colors, this synth wave, the neon lights, then in the 2020s, it seems like we're kind of doing a 90s thing. We're doing grunge again. We're doing depressed disaffection. I understand that even the underground rave scene is making a comeback. And I can't help but think of Mark Fisher, the leftist theorist who kind of shaped a lot of millennial socialists' view in the 2010s with his book Capital Realism. He was also a great lover of electronic music and was very saddened by what he perceived as its decline in the 2000s and 2010s. I feel like some of the mistaken optimism of millennial socialists came from things that appeared in his book Capitalist Realism. There was a chapter in that book titled, "What if there was a protest and everyone came?" And it's like, well, it would be terrible if everyone came because 30% of the people would be there because they want to kill minorities. We know that now. It's something we can take into consideration, something we can plan for. Next time we decide to have a socialist revolution. In the 21st century, isn't Marxism itself a kind of retrofuturism? Why do so many leftists talk like the 20th century didn't happen? We know how these cycles work. We know that a full-blown communist revolution can happen only for capitalism to make a reappearance 80 years later. I realize that a portion of my audience will find that very depressing, but I don't know. I think that Hegel was at least a little bit right. Some things do get better. Even if we take a cyclical view of history, there's got to be a little bit of room for linear progress over the course of all these cycles. I hear a lot of millennial whining. We're the unluckiest generation because we suffered 2008. The worst year. But 2008 was not the worst year, not even close to the worst year. And millennials are so far from the unluckiest generation that it's not even close. It's not even in the same conceptual universe, right? Yes, it sucks that you didn't get your job at Goldman Sachs or whatever, and that you had to move in with your parents. And yeah, it sucks that a lot of people in our generation are not doing financially as well as people 2 generations ago. But on the other hand, how many of us would want to be reborn in 1890? As much as the coronavirus sucked, how many of us died in the war? What war? Exactly. Think about the lost generation. Boys from the lost generation had to die with fleas and rats in mud holes, slumped over barbed wire, choking to death on mustard gas. That's so bad. It's so much worse than any single thing that most American millennials can even begin to comprehend. So I don't really buy this doomer argument that millennials and Gen Z are uniquely unhappy because of neoliberalism. I understand that many people are unhappy because the economy is bad and we can't imagine a better future and global warming, but global warming is not going to have its worst effects on American millennials. It just isn't. There's no hope is still an interpretation of the facts. And leftist doomerism is one particular narrative constructed from facts. This is a point that Mark Fisher himself was kind of ambivalent on. On the one hand, he was kind of a promoter of this idea that mental health is actually a political struggle and that psychiatry is just kind of a personal individualization of what are really social problems. But at other points in his, in my opinion, superior aesthetic work in The Weird and the Eerie and in Ghosts of My Life, he also seems to acknowledge that doomerism is kind of the perspective of a depressed person. Almost what is constitutive of depression is taking the perspective that things will only get worse. I don't like mental health as a starting point for leftist politics. And I don't think Marxists should like it as a starting point for leftist politics either, because it's idealism. I don't like mental health as a starting point for leftist politics because my experience is that becoming more affluent, as I have in the last 8 years, does not, in fact, improve a person's mental health. And in fact, many people much more affluent than me are extremely mentally ill. Hamlet was a prince and he was thinking about stabbing himself. I guess I agree with the Freudian take on neurosis, that it's just kind of the condition of civilized humans.
I've been diagnosed with the anxieties.
I don't see anxiety as the kind of thing that communist revolution is going to fix. I feel like this is a situation that requires therapy or spirituality. So even if millennials failed at our big generational project, well, that's okay. I think most big generational projects do fail. I mean, what was the boomers' big generational political project? Ending the Vietnam War, right? Well, they didn't really succeed at that either, but they made a lot of good music. So even if millennials didn't make socialism happen, it has to be said, we did trans the genders. We trans the genders hard. And I think that's worth something. Anyway, I'm excited to see how Gen Alpha rebels against us in 15 years. Millennials and Gen Z are so uptight, it's gonna be really fun to rebel against us. Concluding Hegelian postscript. Speaking of Hegel, I mentioned earlier the thesis, antithesis, synthesis triad. 9 out of 10 philosophy popularizers will tell you that that's what Hegel's dialectic is, but just for the record, just so you know, Hegel doesn't actually use those terms anywhere, and if you ask pretty much any Hegel scholar, they'll tell you that that's not actually Hegel. And I have known a few, believe me, I have known some Hegel scholars in my time. It's probably the single most popular misunderstanding of any philosopher in the Western canon, I think because thesis, antithesis, synthesis is actually a very easy to understand concept, and you can sort of get what it would mean for that to be implemented in world history. Unfortunately, what Hegel said is something much more difficult to understand. I think it's more something along the lines of abstraction, negation, and then negation of the negation, which is terrible Hegelian jargon, sublation, as far as I know, a word that is not used anywhere outside of Hegel scholarship. Or sometimes I see people describe the dialectical triad as abstract, negation, concrete, which good luck making sense of what that means. Sorry, I just ruined Hegel for you by telling you what Hegel says. Tangent, Granola Fascism, Love and Light, Star Children, Nama Slay. Part 1, The QAnon Shaman. So I don't know if you guys remember this, but on January 6th, 2021, a bunch of people stormed the US Capitol building in what Azealia Banks described as meth behavior. Some of the most iconic images of the January 6th insurrection were of a man in red, white, and blue face paint, a fur hat and horns, carrying a 6-foot spear with an American flag. This person the media termed the QAnon Shaman. He was later arrested and then briefly imprisoned for his role in the insurrection. And then news came out that he had been refusing to eat the prison food because it wasn't organic. That's odd, many people thought. What kind of Trump fanatic is this? Don't these people hate when things are organic? Doesn't Donald Trump eat fried chicken with a fork and a knife on his private jet? Didn't they spend dozens of hours of airtime ruthlessly mocking Michelle Obama's organic garden? What's the deal with the... Okay, we're doing Seinfeld. What's the deal with Jacob Chansley, aka the QAnon Shaman? Who is this man? Well, let's look at these tattoos. I'm seeing what looks like a tree of life, possibly the Nordic image of Yggdrasil. Yggdrasil? Is that how you say that? The tree of life. This Borromean knot of triangles is called a Volknut. It's an old Norse symbol that is usually used by white supremacists these days, but also sometimes by nerds. That looks like a giant Mjolnir, a Thor's hammer. All this is neo-pagan Norse imagery, which has been associated with white nationalists for decades. So all of that is to be expected. But Jacob Chansley also identifies as a shamanic practitioner and a bodhisattva.
As a shamanic practitioner, I have a hyperdimensional consciousness that stretches far beyond the bounds of my physical body. Do you know what a bodhisattva is?
Generally speaking, yeah. Sort of a spiritual figure of sorts that people may follow, yeah.
Well, kind of. It's a spiritual being that attains a certain level of enlightenment, but reincarnates over and over again consciously until the all of humanity is enlightened and brought into an ascended level of consciousness. I am a bodhisattva.
Chansley has previously claimed, quote, "What we did on January 6th in many ways was an evolution in consciousness, because as we marched down the street along these ley lines shouting USA or shouting things like freedom, we were actually affecting the quantum realm. In order to beat this evil occultic force, you need a light occultic force. You need a force that is on the side of God, of love, almost like on the side of the angels, as opposed to the demons. Okay, my initial question for this tangent is, how does an all-organic, hyperdimensional quantum bodhisattva end up storming the Capitol for QAnon? The answer sent me down rabbit holes within rabbit holes. I thought I wasn't in Kansas anymore, only to discover I had entered quantum Kansas. So I've come out of this a changed person, which is too bad, because I feel like this time last year, I was so close to ascending to 5D consciousness. You guys remember the psychedelics tangent? There I was, yapping about vibrations and mandalas and yin and yang energy. I feel like I was this close to enlightenment, but then I started researching granola fascism, and this tangent has completely disillusioned me with spirituality. As of making this video, I feel like I hate spirituality, I hate enlightenment, I hate God. And because you voted for this, it's your fault that I'm going to spend the rest of my life in Tamasic ignorance. Just kidding, it's fine. I'll just do more acid and consult the Akashic records. Part 2. All fascism is granola fascism. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. What do we mean by granola? Wikipedia defines granola as a food consisting of rolled oats, nuts, seeds, honey, or other sweeteners, such as brown sugar, and sometimes puffed rice, that's usually baked until crisped, toasted, and golden brown. Granola is literally a crunchy snack, but it came into prominence in the United States in the 1970s as part of the health food movement, part of a kind of general new age wellness moment in this country, when the revolutionary consciousness of the counterculture was sort of transformed into a more tranquilized form of hippie lifestyle. So when we say someone is granola or crunchy, we mean that they are far out, they're new age, they're woo-woo. Am I making myself clear? Granola means that someone likes spending time outdoors, and they probably put yogurt into bodily orifices other than the mouth. When I proposed this video topic, I was thinking of QAnon shamans and of like body fascist Instagram yoginis. But on further reflection and further research, there's actually a case to be made that fascism was always granola fascism. And by that I mean that fascism has always been concerned with health and fitness and fertility and spirituality. This is something that has been academically explored since at least 1985's The Occult Roots of Nazism, a book that explored the New Age spiritual beliefs of the Third Reich. Nazis had their own form of occultism called Aryosophy, or Aryan wisdom, which was this kind of mix of yoga and Nordic neo-paganism and Eastern religions and Hermetic Kabbalah. This is why the imagery of the Third Reich is associated with so many runes, the swastika, obviously. There's this branch of Aryosophy called theozoology, an extremely sinister pseudoscience created by Jörg Lanz von Liebenfels, which claimed that the Aryan race descended from interstellar beings, whereas the lower races, or quote-unquote sodomite apelings, Jesus Christ, were the result of breeding between humans and ape men? Okay. There was this preoccupation with preventing miscegenation, the famous racial purity that the Nazis are so well known for. The theozoologist Liebenfels himself was a big proponent of castrating racially inferior men, which I think speaks very loudly to the kind of insecurities and preoccupations that underlie this entire line of thinking. Cuckoldry. It always goes back to cuckoldry. I don't know what the deal is with cuckoldry, but everyone's obsessed with cuckoldry. Not everyone, but you know, in the Dritte Reich, it's a lot of concern about cuckoldry. One thing I can't help but notice, though, is that this idea of the Aryan race descending from interstellar beings has a family resemblance to kind of new age hippie beliefs about star children and like ancient aliens interbreeding with pre-modern civilizations. One Aryosophist idea was that the Aryan race are quote-unquote Hyperboreans. Hyperboreans were this ancient Greek idea of like this northern people that were descendants of the survivors of Atlantis. This is mentioned by Plato, for example. Personally, I think if the Nazis are survivors of Atlantis, then I wish that everyone had sunk. It was actually Liebenfels himself who was the first to use the swastika as a German nationalist symbol in the flag of the proto-fascist Order of the New Templars. Heinrich Himmler, an architect of the Holocaust and all around one of the most evil bastards that ever walked this planet, founded a organization called the Ahnenerbe, an SS think tank whose mission was to research the Nazi idea that the Aryan race was responsible for most of the important achievements in human history. So the Ahnenerbe tried to shore up evidence of a historical Aryan invasion or expansion. So, for example, they wanted to claim that the Buddha was of the Aryan race. They sent expeditions to Tibet to measure skulls. Fascists to this day admire the so-called wisdom of this French woman who named herself Savitri Devi. She wanted to synthesize Hinduism and Nazism and thought that Hitler was an avatar of Vishnu. Honestly, Europeans should never have been allowed to know about Hinduism. It's obviously too much for the European mind to comprehend. Fascist occultism has crunchy predecessors in Western esotericism, that is, Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, Mesmerism, Spiritualism, German and English Romanticism, the Theosophy movement of Helena Blavatsky, and the Anthroposophy of Rudolf Steiner. All of these esoteric traditions represent an attempt at a third way between science and Orthodox religion. I guess I should explain what esoteric means. I don't want to be condescending, but not everyone has a humanities degree. Some people did something useful with their lives. In religion and spirituality, there's a distinction between esoteric and exoteric, which are Greek words basically meaning inside, esoteric, and outside, exoteric. So, for example, a philosopher in ancient Greece might have had public teachings, the exoteric teachings, and secret teachings, the esoteric teachings. In more practical terms, exoteric means normie. Mainstream Orthodox religious belief and practice is exoteric, whereas esoteric refers to people who are on some kind of spiritual journey, but who think they're too smart to go to church with the other sheeple. In fascist esotericism, the big name, in my opinion, is the Italian Julius Evola, if you prefer your fascismo with a Mediterranean twist. Julius Evola was born Giulio Cesare, which name was apparently not Roman enough, so he had to become Julius. Okay, buddy. He also looks like a Batman villain with his monocle. Ridiculous. Evola was a self-proclaimed super fascist and advocate of spiritual racism. Evola is cited as an influence by Trump's former chief strategist, Steve Bannon, and is one of the favorite philosophers of a Nordic fascist YouTuber who you may have heard of called The Golden One. For the sake of this tangent, because I love you guys so much that I'm willing to degrade myself in any way imaginable, I actually read Evola's book, Revolt Against the Modern World. I feel kind of filthy even owning this, but that's part of the fun. Honestly, reading Evola has actually been kind of almost refreshing to me because he just says the quiet part out loud. He just tweets it out. I'm so used to 21st century fascists who obfuscate all of their beliefs in this ever shifting cloud of nonsense that it's honestly kind of a relief when to find a fascist who finally just says oh yeah, I believe in racism. Of course I believe in racism. Thank you for just saying it instead of just using a million dog whistles and saying a bunch of nonsense about identitarian ethno. I don't know. I hate that. I'm so tired of that nonsense. It's kind of surreal to read Evola because he's formally theorizing a lot of ideas that I've only really experienced as memes. For example, this whole idea of tradition versus modernity, as in Red Vern to tradition. This is Evola. Evola's influence is gigantic on internet fascism. I feel like it doesn't get talked about enough. Evola kind of blends all pre-modern cultures from around the world into this monolithic concept of quote-unquote tradition, which he contrasts positively with the degenerate modern world. Evola advocates a cyclical model of time with 4 stages. Does that sound familiar to anyone who watched the Generations tangent? Evola adopts, what he claims, I'm not going to say that any of this actually has anything to do with Hinduism because I know that European fascists using Hindu concepts tend to be very sketchy. So I'm not saying this is what Hinduism says, I'm saying this is what Evola Evola Thinks Hinduism says. Evola adopts what he says is a 4-stage Hindu model of cyclical time, and he claims that we are currently in the Kali Yuga, that is the darkest, most chaotic age of the cycle, and that a new kind of glorious turning awaits us, which is actually pretty comparable to kind of American New Age claims that we're experiencing, or at least maybe in the 60s and 70s, we're experiencing a dawning of the age of Aquarius that based on sort of an astrological cyclical view of time. Evola's super fascist claim is that this new age that is dawning will restore a mythical Aryan race. So we have this kind of anti-Darwinian fixation on a pre-modern age of gods from which modern races have supposedly degenerated to varying degrees. So whereas Darwinism says that humans kind of evolved from lower species, we climbed out of the mud, fascist spiritualists and also New Age granola people tend to claim that it's the opposite, that we fell out of the sky, which is usually the pre-modern claim, that humans are kind of fallen angels, as opposed to the Darwinian idea that we are risen beasts. Another granola thread in Evola's thinking is ecofascism. So that would be a focus on the soil part of Blood and Soil. Though honestly, as a spiritual racist, I think Evola might not agree with Blood and Soil. It would be Spirit and Soil. He's not claiming to be scientific. He's trying to revolt against science, right? Because science is part of modernity. So he's claiming that what makes the Aryan race is a kind of spiritual superiority rather than like a genetic one or like an IQ kind of claim. You know, there's a lot of intricacies to racist thought that I feel like this is not me defending racists. I'm just saying, like, if you want to understand racism, like, you have to understand that racism is more nuanced than people tend to think. White supremacist thinking is usually not as simple as white supremacists, oh, they just love all white people and they hate all non-white people. No, that's not the case at all. They actually hate most white people because they see most white people in the modern era as degenerate race traitors. And they actually admire a lot of people from non-white races who they see as like strong, as like champions of their race. So for example, on the Golden Ones YouTube channel, there is a video quoting, oh, look who it is. It is the French Nazi spiritualist Savitri Devi on Genghis Khan, who the Golden One loves. Though on a repeat watch of this video, it actually appears that Devi is claiming that Genghis Khan is Aryan, a blue-eyed hero. Which, like, why am I even engaging with this, right? Fuck these people. Well, part of the reason I think it's important to do that is because if people don't have an accurate understanding of what racists think, then they're unable to recognize racism because they'll be like, oh, how could he possibly be racist? He loves Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan isn't white. And it's like, well, that's not really how racists think, right? Like you have to get into the details. It actually kind of matters. You have to learn the intricacies of fascist nonsense. That's what we're trying to do today. Okay, so all the intricacies of eco-fascism are fully on display in Evola, who diagnoses a core problem of modernity as simultaneous overpopulation and underpopulation. Underpopulation is, of course, a problem in the Aryan race. The Aryan race is just not reproducing enough. Constant fertility problems with the Aryan race. Many such complaints. And on the other hand, Evola complains about the overpopulation of the Untermenschen, those sodomite apelings whom Evola compares to a metastasizing cancer or teeming worms, and which Evola's modern-day devotees still use as a pretext for banning immigration. 21st century eco-fascism usually blames the other for environmental problems, so far-right fascist figures often kind of claim a type of environmentalism. It's just that it's always someone else's fault, right? It's China's fault, it's the third world's fault, it's the globalists' fault. But all of this should encourage us to be a little bit cautious about how we approach environmentalism, because there are people claiming to speak for environmentalism who do so in a way that speaks of humans as like a virus, and often this kind of thinking ends up being racist and ends up blaming like the teeming third world masses or something for environmental problems, you have to remember that it's blood and soil. Just because someone is claiming to care about the soil does not mean that they are progressive. I know it's cliche to point this out, but Hitler was in fact a vegetarian, as was at times Richard Wagner and Friedrich Nietzsche. This was very much a common notion in late 19th, early 20th century German thought, a kind of crunchy granola strain of romanticism. Natural food, fitness, vegetarianism, the Nibelungenlied, all the classics, all the hits. So we have in German and Italian fascism a focus on fitness, health, fertility, and spiritual syncretism, the occult, which is a little bit awkward because doesn't all of that also describe American New Age spirituality and wellness culture? Part 3. New Age as fascism's doppelganger. Now I need to be very clear what I am and am not saying here because I do worry that people are going to caricature this tangent as me saying that New Age spirituality is fascist, or hippies are fascist, or fitness is fascist, or anything like that. No, I'm not saying that. I am not saying that New Age spirituality is fascist. What I do want to say, though, is similar to what Naomi Klein says in her recent book, Doppelganger, which describes the right-wing conspiracy theorist world as a through-the-looking-glass double of the crunchy granola left. And the most concerning aspect of this situation is that crunchy granola feelings, whether left or right, can kind of be played on by conspiracy theorists and lead to what Naomi Klein calls diagonalism, which is the breakdown of traditional left-right distinctions that occurred especially during the coronavirus pandemic, uniting people across the political spectrum in an anti-science, anti-vaccine cause. Now, I should probably define New Age. New Age is a mildly derogatory term for a Western spiritual awakening beginning in England and the United States in the 1970s. New Age involves a syncretism of pre-modern ideas, which in some ways resembles fascist occultism, although doesn't necessarily adopt fascist politics. So New Age is an umbrella term for a collection of new religious movements in the West, which syncretize a very wide range of occult, esoteric, indigenous, and Eastern religions, as well as like psychedelic drug culture and eclectic pseudoscience. We're talking about yoga, Reiki, essential oils, Anunnaki from the planet Nibiru, Atlantis, 5D, 5G, the Illuminati, Ayurveda, crystals, channeling, angels, homeopathy, QAnon, tarot, wellness, the Akashic Records, psychedelics, cleanses, the anti-vax movement, energy healing, quantum healing, synergy, astrology, UFOs, chakras, herbal medicine, sacred geometry, ayahuasca, coffee enemas. New Age is a buffet approach to world religions mixed in with a little bit of clairvoyance, a little bit of telepathy, maybe even a little bit of necromancy. So I'm like overcome with anxiety as I'm filming this because I feel like it kind of comes across like I'm trashing people's beliefs and religion. And who am I to judge your necromancy? And I have no right to do that because, like, do I have like a better system to replace the ideas that I'm trashing? No. And like people need to believe something, right? I'm not trying to be an asshole. I'm not trying to be contrarian. I'm not trying to be an annoying skeptic. I'm not telling people what to believe. I'm just asking questions. I'm sure all of us like some element of New Age. I mean, with such an expansive collection of concepts, virtually anyone is bound to like at least something in there. But taken together, New Age is like the religion of a certain class of like overeducated, rich white people, especially on the West Coast and Sedona. It often gets mixed up with the kind of like wellness capitalism of fitness culture and is sometimes malignant exoticism bordering on noble savage romanticization of pre-modern culture. The current avatar of all this is the musician Shannon Blake.
I've been chilling in the mountains of Peru. Drinking ayahuasca with the shaman stew.
Who, in the month that I'm making this video, the entire internet has decided to hate. When the entire internet decides to hate one woman, I usually roll my eyes because that's kind of a suspect process that we go through on Cycle. But I do think Shannon Blake has been chosen as a target of hate because she represents a lot of like white people, quote unquote, spiritualist practices that are widely regarded as annoying and justifiably so.
I've been learning shit from the aliens, like how we're all connected to the pyramids. Used to be a broke bitch, now I'm cashing my checks because I tapped into collective consciousness.
Another dimension of New Age involves a kind of synthesis of religion with science fiction. So you get UFO cults like Heaven's Gate, or like new mythologies about history like the Star Children idea, or the ancient aliens hypothesis that Anunnaki from the planet Nibiru like interbred with ancient people.
I've been learning shit from the aliens, like how we're all connected to the pyramids.
It's kind of just a high-tech version of the Hyperborean hypothesis. What are ancient Egyptian time travelers doing in Atlantis? Is it possible that JFK knew the secret and that's why? The globalists? New Age politics tends to begin with a disenchantment with modernism, though generally not with a disenchantment with capitalism, which is usually left out of the analysis.
Used to be a broke bitch, now I'm cashing my checks because I tapped into collective consciousness.
I think it would be fair to say that New Age shares with fascism a nostalgia for a pre-modern golden age influenced by Romanticism. By Romanticism, I do mean the 19th century idea of Romanticism. Basically, as soon as the Industrial Revolution occurred, there was immediately an artistic and philosophical backlash against it, represented in England by poets like Wordsworth, or in the US by thinkers like Emerson and Thoreau. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with this type of romanticism. It's unfortunate, I think, that it's been abused so much. Though honestly, I don't really identify with this form of romanticism. I like my romanticism dark and decadent. Wordsworth can rub one out to a daffodil for all I care. As far as a cabin in the woods, I don't think I could tolerate that even as long as Thoreau did. I want to return to this concept of the shape of time. So remember, the super fascist Evola says that there has been a historical de-evolution of humanity from gods or ancient aliens, might be the more new agey way of putting it. On YouTube, there's a video adaptation of a creation myth written by Charles Eisenstein called A Gathering of the Tribe, which tells a new agey kind of ancient aliens origin story for humanity.
Once upon a time, a great tribe of people lived in a world far away from ours. They lived in a state of enchantment and joy. My friends, she said, there is a world that needs our help. It is called Earth. You will be separated from the wonder and beauty of our world, and from the love that bathes us all. You will be told in a million ways that a world of destruction, drudgery, anxiety, and degradation is normal. A memory of your true origin will be encoded in your DNA.
In a way, it's kind of like Aristophanes' fable in Plato's Symposium, right? Where he talks about, this is the myth about the people divided in half, and what erotic longing is the desire for being reunited with your other half. Except in this creation myth, it's new agey, so it's like, it's aliens. Aliens sent us to Earth, and now we want to be reunited with the aliens. Sliving. I've noticed certain patterns in a kind of quote-unquote apolitical critique of modernity that lends itself to either New Age or to fascist reaction, but not to Marxist or leftist politics. And I want to point that out, but I'm already worried about attacking people's religion, and now I'm attacking people's artistic preferences. Am I just determined to make everyone hate me? I feel like this is a mean tangent. Like, I'm making so many enemies. In my notes, I'm looking at this list of artists that I'm now supposed to criticize, but I'm like too timid to actually do it, because if I criticize them, then what if people criticize me, and I can't handle that? Look, I'm not saying these artists are bad. I'm just saying that their art, for me, represents a kind of critique of modernity that is kind of alarmingly shallow, maybe, in its analysis, and therefore vulnerable to misuse. The animator Steve Cutts has many millions of views on YouTube for these videos that present this kind of dystopic view of modernity. The most notorious one is the music video for the Moby song Are You Lost in the World Like Me, which presents a very what if phones but too much, I'm 14 and this is deep kind of view of the dystopian nature of modernity. Behold the vanity of woman. Groundbreaking. Recurring themes in these animations are that industrial agriculture is bad, public transit is bad and disgusting, junk food is bad, big pharma is bad, taking pills is bad, taking selfies is bad, phones are bad, work is bad. Phones are so bad. Phones are bad. Phones are bad. Women are bad. But you know what's really bad? Fat people. I don't like this. I don't know. Like, I agree with some of these things. I especially am inclined to agree with the kind of critique of industrial agriculture, that this is like a horrible abuse of sentient animals. But the way this genre of art consistently uses fatness as a symbol of gluttony and decadence and the horrors of modernity really kind of alarms me, because to me this feels like what is called body fascism. The term body fascism refers to a set of ideas and sentiments in fitness culture that kind of treat fatness as a symbol of moral failure and treat healthy, read thin, athletic bodies as virtuous and kind of more deserving of life. There's often a strong classist undercurrent to this way of seeing the world that for me is associated with Jamie Oliver, the celebrity chef who has these videos about chicken nuggets. Dan Olson did a whole video about this where he argues that chicken nuggets are like this dirty, vile food that's making us all unhealthy. And like, look how terrible it is that children will eat chicken nuggets, even though they've seen that it's made with the dirty, unclean parts of the bird. Behold these swine swollen on fast food and big pharma. I realize body fascism is like a little bit of a hyperbole, but I still think that fascism as a kind of generic derogatory term is still warranted here, because this kind of thinking can turn really ugly and kind of eugenicist very quickly. Naomi Klein describes this experience she had while canvassing in Canada, where she stopped at this like hippie house with like sandalwood incense burning and statues of devas in the window, and some like white woman wearing yoga pants comes out, and they get to talking about politics, and this woman brings up that she's like a single issue anti-vaccine passport voter. And I guess Naomi kind of tries to be like, well, you know, it's great that you're healthy and that, you know, your immune system can just reject COVID or whatever it is that people think they can do. But like, some people have compromised immune systems. And this woman says, I think those people should die. And that sort of thing does sound a little bit like eugenics. And unfortunately, digging into the history of fitness and even yoga as we in the Western world know it, eugenics is not a kind of new development in these areas. In the first years of the 20th century, the German bodybuilder Eugene Sandow toured the world promoting what was called at the time physical culture, what we would now call fitness. Eugene is not his birth name, it's a name he gave himself. And according to the authors of the book Conspirituality, he named himself after eugenics. This guy was apparently received as a celebrity when he visited India, where physical culture had some influence in the development of what we now think of as yoga. That is, yoga as asanas, poses that are performed as a form of fitness. This is in contrast with yoga as a like 2,000 plus year old tradition of spirituality, where yoga, like as a Hindu practice, was traditionally associated with meditation, concentration. Yoga is a cognate of the English word yoke, Indo-European. It's crazy. So yoga is a discipline that aims towards uniting the human mind with the divine and towards training concentration. But as a form of exercise, it has been incorporated into a Western culture of quote-unquote wellness that assigns moral value to health and fitness and thinness. And unfortunately, during the coronavirus pandemic, the kind of ugly undercurrents of this culture really surfaced. And anyone who has a little bit of a eugenics tendency really kind of brought that out during those years. We have Canadian hippies talking about how disabled people deserve to die. I've observed a very sinister handshake taking place between the anti-disabled people and the anti-fat people and the anti-trans people, where the shared obsession is fertility, a classic fascist neurosis. You have the golden one promoting the no-fap movement.
If you imagine your ancestors are watching you, they see you fapping ferociously to another man ramming a woman. And if you want some motivation as to not do this, you can just meditate upon the amount of energy and vitality that your dragon's breath contains.
Tucker Carlson released that insane video on scrotum tanning. The New Age slogan, mind, body, spirit, sounds like it's full of love and light, but there's a potentially sinister interpretation of this that implies that a defective body equals a defective spirit. Someone who is disabled or immunocompromised must be that way because of a spiritual defect. In her book Natural Causes, Barbara Ehrenreich argues that body fascism is actually a freak consequence not of a New Age mind-body-spirit unity, but of traditional Cartesian mind-body dualism. Specifically, fitness culture often emphasizes these phrases like mind over matter, pain is weakness leaving the body, that amount to a kind of submission of the body to the mind, a dominance of the mind over the body. You could call it sadism of the mind, masochism of the body. It's maybe similar to the so-called holy anorexia of certain Christian mystics for whom their frail, starved bodies reflected spiritual discipline, spiritual strength. This is not by any means exclusive to New Age thinking. It's in a lot of Christian thinking in the US as well. The Netflix documentary The Way Down discusses a Christian weight loss cult led by Gwen Shamblin in Tennessee, where again you have this idea that being thin equals being healthy equals being the spiritual elect. And I assume all of this is correlated with pure unvaccinated semen. If you break down New Age thinking to its most brutally simplistic elements, what you get is the 2006 best-selling book, The Secret. Quote, remember that your thoughts are the primary cause of everything. It's literally just magical thinking, wishful thinking, the idea that you can manifest reality through your thoughts. It's a denial of Freud's reality principle, the idea that you can return to this infantile state of thinking that if you will something, it becomes reality. Is literally just the hippie version of the Protestant American prosperity gospel, which claims that God favors the elect with material wealth. For people who need their magic to have a scientific veneer, we have Deepak Chopra, a quote-unquote quantum mystic who asserts that quantum physics somehow proves that magic is real. Deepak Chopra is literally just The Secret, but with a bunch of pseudoscientific hand-waving to convince people who think they're too smart to believe in The Secret. The authors of Conspirituality say that the fundamental New Age belief is thoughts create reality. The New Age political view is that, quote, inner peace will create world peace. This is a fundamentally anti-leftist notion. The argument is that there is no need for a collective political revolution because what's really needed is an individual spiritual revolution. So New Age thinking tends to dismiss politics as divisive. because we can all agree that ancient Egyptian aliens are using 5G networks to space laser us straight back to Atlantis. The leftist documentarian Adam Curtis claims that the fitness culture of the 1980s replaced the revolutionary energy of 1960s social unrest. Naomi Klein calls the fitness obsession neoliberalism of the body. The perfectionistic ethics of fitness culture, which says that your domain of control is focused on your own body, is the result of self-care replacing politics entirely. And somehow, perfecting your body always seems to cost a lot of money. So in a way, granola fascism is just the sister of granola capitalism.
Used to be a broke bitch, now I'm cashing my checks cause I tapped into collective consciousness.
Part 4. Conspirituality. In their book, Conspirituality, Derek Barris, Matthew Remski, and Julian Walker describe conspirituality as a synthesis of New Age with conspiracy theory culture. They describe the tenets of conspirituality as, quote, nothing happens by accident, nothing is as it seems, and everything is connected. These are slogans more or less shared explicitly or implicitly between New Age spirituality and conspiracy theory culture. New Age and conspiracy thinking share a hunger for meaning. They feel that all of reality should be comprehensible to the intuition of any individual human mind. This is a way of seeing that is epistemically empowering. In Under the Eye of Power, Colin Dickey claims that conspiracy thinking paradoxically soothes anxiety. Conspiracy theories promote a seemingly terrifying view of society as controlled by secret cabals of Satanists and pedophiles, but these terrifying visions are soothing in that they are comprehensible. They supply meaning and make order out of chaos. Colin Dickey compares conspiracy thinking to polytheism. Conspiracy theories fill a void in meaning in secular democracies, replacing monarchy and God as the agentive forces behind what leftists would describe as systemic effects. Barris, Remski, and Walker describe conspirituality as disaster spirituality, playing off Naomi Klein's concept of disaster capitalism, the idea being that conspirituality offers some consolation in the form of meaning and narrative explanation when terrifying events rip our world apart. So during the coronavirus pandemic, we saw more conspiracy theorizing than I have ever seen since 9/11 in the United States, which was the last time that something so major seemed to threaten the predictable order of society. Here's a conspiracy theory meme from the 2000s that I've thought about like once a week for the last decade and a half. The occult numerology of 9/11. The meme explains the meaning of 9/11 using numerology, tarot, Kabbalah, satanic geometry. It's easy to laugh this sort of thing off as like schizoid rambling, but there's a fairly clear emotional logic behind the need to produce this type of explanation. People want to feel that they are in control of their own reality, that events are predictable, that disasters have meaning. And for a lot of people, Marxist, materialist explanations of the causes behind world events are sort of emotionally unsatisfying. And so pre-modern magical thinking is revived to kind of soothe that anxiety. It's an emotional desperation that's unfortunately very easy to exploit. So Remski, for example, who is a survivor of multiple cults, describes a kind of oscillation that cult leaders will often engage in between terrifying their followers, usually demonstrating to them how scary the outside world is, and soothing the followers, reassuring them that inside the sect, the cult, the group, the family, they're safe, they're taken care of. Explanations for everything that occurs are on offer. The inner circle is a safe oasis. The coronavirus pandemic instigated an explosion of conspirituality, and we're still living in the aftermath of that. A lot of major celebrity commentators turned conspiritualists in the last few years. Obviously, Joe Rogan, not necessarily a conspiritualist himself, but sort of a blank slate of a man who has promoted a lot of conspirituality. Naomi Wolf, Naomi Klein's doppelganger, was a leading third-wave feminist who has turned conspiracy lunatic. She's now a regular guest on Steve Bannon's podcast. She tweets about how Bell Belfast has pre-5G air that is still calm, still peaceful, restful, natural, like in the 70s. You know, Belfast in the 70s, a very calm, peaceful place. She did what in my opinion is one of the best tweets of all time, spiraling into despair over the vaccination of Stanley Bear. No! Russell Brand, a popular once leftist podcaster who has some allegations and has now gone full conspiracy theorist, ranting about the deep state on Rumble because YouTube demonetized him. Don't subscribe. Awaken. Christiane Northrup, apparently an actual doctor at one point and author of the best-selling Women's Bodies, Women's Wisdom, is now a complete conspiracy theorist quack who uses tarot cards to diagnose illnesses and increase the flow of chi to the vagina. In 2020, she promoted a lot of QAnon-adjacent content and claims to have lived in Atlantis in a previous incarnation. Why is it always Atlantis? I feel like Atlantis keeps coming up. I completely disagree with everything Christiane Northrup is saying. Uphold germ theory, fuck Atlantis. But I do feel like we need to make a few concessions to alternative medicine here, because if we don't do that, then we lose the argument. Because the average person's experience with mainstream medicine is that it super fucking sucks. And I feel like it's important to empathize with that experience and understand it. If you want to read a critique of Western scientific medicine from someone who actually knows what they're talking about and is not a quack, I suggest Natural Causes by Barbara Ehrenreich, which describes how women in particular often have an experience with the mainstream medical system that is degrading and ineffective. There's a genuinely really ugly tradition of patriarchal gynecology and obstetrics that makes a lot of women rightfully skeptical about giving birth in a hospital, and has led to a reemergence of midwives and doulas to fill these roles that are not being filled by the mainstream scientific medical establishment. Ehrenreich describes how med students are trained on dissecting corpses, which kind of inculcates an attitude of objectification that to actual conscious human patients is really alienating and objectifying to be on the receiving end of. You feel like your humanity is an inconvenience to the physician. I understand why people hate it, and I can really understand why they'd hate it in the case of something life-threatening like cancer. Imagine being unceremoniously told that you have breast cancer and need to get a double mastectomy and some torturous chemotherapy treatments. Good luck. That'll be $50,000. Like, yeah, it's not a mystery why someone in that situation would rather have a crystal healer give them actual human care and affection in a room with decent lighting. The problem, though, is that women's, and I guess also men's, justifiable skepticism about mainstream medicine is then abused by New Age charlatans. So we have Christiane Northrup saying that the germ theory of disease is a patriarchal big pharma myth, and she's still on YouTube telling her followers that IBS, chronic fatigue syndrome, thyroid disorders, obesity, diabetes, and breast cancer are caused by quote-unquote inflammation, which in turn is caused by energy vampires who sap the life out of empaths.
Energy vampires are people who feed off of the life force of others. They do this by targeting empaths or highly sensitive people.
And what treatment does she prescribe for energy vampirism? To pledge allegiance to yourself.
I pledge allegiance to myself and to my soul for which I stand. I honor my goodness, my gifts, and my talents. I commit to remaining loyal to myself.
You know, I do still wonder if genuine fascism could actually exist in America, because this country has a cowboy ethos that doesn't really lend itself to collectivism. But I do think that fascism can take various forms, and if it sometimes appears more spiritual, sometimes more quote-unquote scientific, then I think maybe it can sometimes appear more collectivist and maybe more individualist. In America, we have the individualistic version of fascism playing out to the extreme. In my weird, sad country, the central conflict revealed by the coronavirus pandemic is that epidemiology, the study of disease at the level of society, fundamentally is in conflict with individualism. For Americans, maybe for North Americans in general, the terrifying collective truth of public health is that disease is basically not in the realm of individual control. And a lot of Americans, especially more affluent Americans, cannot accept that something important is not in their control. The paradox within conspirituality, which I think justifies our use of the extreme term fascism, is that the clinging to individual control leads a lot of people to support authoritarianism in the form of someone like Donald Trump. I guess you could say even cowboys need a daddy. Part 5, Wellness Culture and the Denial of Death. Anthropologist Ernest Becker, in his 1973 book, The Denial of Death, says, quote, "Consciousness of death is the primary repression, not sexuality." The idea is that Freud is wrong, that sex is the fundamental taboo, and in fact, is the realization that we personally are going to die. That is just too much for us, we can't handle it, and we will do anything to deny it. Sometimes this is subtle, so Becker points to Homeric heroics and heroic Homerics as a case of people trying to conquer mortality through memorable actions. I feel like we all do some version of this. Most people want to live beyond their life, whether it's in the form of having children or making YouTube videos. But sometimes the denial of death is more literal, like people actually straight up refusing to even intellectually acknowledge that they will die. And nowhere is that more prevalent than in wellness culture. The denial of death is the root of a lot of the really insidious ableism and fat phobia. There's this karmic idea that, if you're sick, if you're disabled, if you're overweight, that is a reflection of a spiritual failure on your part. If you die of cancer, that must be a karmic consequence of some wellness sins you have committed. And that kind of denialism is taken to, what you would think would be impossible extremes in a lot of New Age cults. For example, the Love Has Won cult, led by Amy Carlson, aka Mother God, was so in denial about Amy's death from a combination, it seems, of alcoholism, anorexia, and colloidal silver poisoning, hence the blue color of her skin, that they casually, low-key mummified her body in a sleeping bag, wrapped the woman in Christmas lights, and carried her corpse across 5 state lines. I mean, at least the ancient Egyptians really knew what they were doing when it comes to mummification, but it does have you wondering about the motivation behind some of those practices, and of the Great Pyramids for that matter. Did the seed that grew into the Great Pyramids begin with a kind of improvised denial? Or was it aliens? I see wellness culture as motivated not just by a denial of death, but also, at the same time, a desire for meaning. In Natural Causes, Barbara Ehrenreich argues that ritual is actually essential to medicine. And she's echoed by Amanda Montell, who argues in Cultish that ritual is an essential aspect of fitness culture. There's a chapter in Cultish that examines fitness cults like SoulCycle and CrossFit, where using a specialized culty vocabulary and chanting mantras is an essential part of the community that these gyms establish. Ehrenreich argues that a lot of the standard practices of Western medicine don't in fact have that strong a basis in scientific evidence, and in effect serve a basically ritual function in our healthcare system. She includes in this category the yearly physical exam, which is a kind of medical ritual of dominance and submission. Bataille would say a permitted transgression, right? This kind of unique circumstance where it's acceptable for an authority figure to ask you to strip naked and submit yourself to penetration. The underlying conflict that seems to motivate fascism and New Age and alternative medicine is a kind of war between meaning and facts, religion and science, tradition and modernity. The modern world is often experienced as full of facts, but empty of meaning. Scientific medicine is often perceived as soulless, as objectifying. When you go to the doctor, you become a collection of organ systems for diagnosis and treatment. This interaction lacks care, it lacks human connection, it lacks ritual meaning. Some kind of alternative medicine probably is needed to fill that void, but I think alternative medicine goes too far when it attacks modernity itself. A lot of the antipathy towards modernity, of whatever political origin, is based on wounded ego feelings that honestly, we all kind of just need to get over. And I think the purpose of spirituality should be to help us get over it, to help us get over the grandiose narcissist inside all of us that wants to be recognized as the center of the universe, as the immortal God. Freud said that there were 3 scientific revolutions that have wounded humanity's ego. First, the Copernican revolution, which told us that we are not the center of the universe, not even the center of the solar system. And then there was the Darwinian revolution, which said that we are not the descendants of gods, but the descendants of beasts. And there is no special magic that separates us from other animals. And then finally, there is Freud's own psychoanalytic revolution, which says that not only are we not metaphysically different from animals, but also our claim to being rational is not even very legitimate. And that reason is kind of a scum on the surface of a pond of the unconscious, where the pre-modern irrational is very much alive. I think these ego wounds are the reason why society is in kind of a constant state of rebellion against scientific rationality itself. Society has never really collectively accepted psychoanalysis. We're not ready for that yet. Freud is like a 22nd century thinker that was somehow born in the 19th century. Darwin is continuously up for debate, and it seems like increasingly Copernicus is open to being questioned again as well. Flat Earth content has been pretty rampant on the internet for the last 10 years.
My name is Logan Paul, and I think I'm coming out of the flat earth closet.
And I do think geocentrism is the endpoint of the anti-modern mood. Anti-modern movements, from quantum mysticism to Italian fascism, attack modernity by attacking reason. Umberto Eco says, fascism can be defined as irrationalism. Eco argues that a cult fascist syncretism must tolerate contradictions, explaining them away as perspectives on the same perennial truth. Dan Olson argues that for fascists and conspiracy theorists, contradiction and falsehood are a show of strength. If you are a fascist who considers the will to power not just as psychology but as metaphysics, then what greater flex is there than to overpower logic, truth, and reality itself? The strategy is to defeat democracy by defeating reason. And we can reconsider that QAnon shaman interview that I opened this tangent with in light of this. The shaman argues, first, that the violence on January 6th was in fact committed by Antifa and Black Lives Matter.
I think it's more like the deep state setup riots than Trump riots. I don't think Trump had people do that. I think it was more likely that the feds and the crowd and Antifa and BLM were largely responsible. And
then he argues that it was actually all the fault of the deep state for not allowing the National Guard to intervene.
No, what I'm saying, dude, is that it was a setup on behalf of the deep state. If they allowed the National Guard to be there, it never would have happened.
And finally, he argues that the insurrection was in fact a noble patriot uprising against a stolen election.
You're saying it was Antifa and the FBI, but aren't you evidence that that's not the case, Jake?
Q most certainly did send me, ladies and gentlemen. Q is the highest levels of the military, and they are disseminating above top secret information to patriots in our republic so that we can take back our country from the communists and the globalists.
Is 3 completely contradictory explanations offered in quick succession. And I think that we should interpret this not as confusion on his part, but as a deliberate use of contradiction as a flex. Eco says that for fascists, thinking is a form of emasculation, which is both a strength and a weakness. Fascist governments are condemned to lose wars because they're constitutionally incapable of objectively evaluating the force of the enemy. Likewise, the magical thinking of wellness culture rejects science so that it can assert the power of individual mind and spirit, to return to the infantile delusion of the omnipotence of thoughts. The disconnection from reality is their weakness, but the promise of meaning is a strength. Leftist structural analysis often makes people feel powerless, anxious, guilty, or angry, whereas New Age spirituality is soothing, and most people will choose to be soothed rather than choosing misery. New Age magic makes you feel important, safe, in control.
Cause it's my reality and some may think it's not conceited. If you want it, just believe it.
But it is a delusion, a denial of death, and to me, that's not spirituality. That's anti-spirituality. I think spirituality, if it's good for anything at all, shouldn't it help us yield to death, to chaos, to non-self? The spirituality of wellness culture often instructs us to cling ever more desperately to self, to immortality, to delusions of omnipotence, and that to me is worse than materialism. Plato said that philosophy is learning how to die, training for death, but I guess that's kind of a downer.
Your ancestors are watching you, they see you fapping ferociously to another man.
Hard iron sharpens iron, as they say.